Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Tale Shadow. I know many of you use these stories to help you drift off to sleep. So before you do, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from, whether you're across the globe or just down the street. And of course, if you're enjoying the video, don't forget to like and subscribe. Now, let's dive into tonight's story, The Clock That Ticks Backwards. It was a quiet, unassuming house nestled in the rolling hills of the countryside. Perfect, really, for Daniel and Rachel Taylor and their two children, Sarah and Jack. The house had been abandoned for years, its paint faded and chipped, the lawn overgrown with weeds. But there was something about it that felt right, as though it was waiting for them. The family had spent months searching for a place to call home, and this house, with its creaking floors and crooked windows, seemed to beckon them in with the promise of a fresh start. The first night in the house, they felt the usual discomfort that comes with any move. Unfamiliar sounds, the odd scent of old wood and dust, the strangeness of sleeping in a new place. But it was peaceful, too peaceful. The only sound to be heard was the ticking of a grandfather clock in the hallway, a relic of the house's past, tall and ornate, its brass pendulum swinging in slow rhythm. Rachel had noticed it when they first entered. The clock stood out not only for its age, but for the peculiar detail of the face. The numbers, worn and faded, seemed to be constantly shifting in the dim light, as if they were never quite in place. But she didn't think much of it. It was an old house, after all, and old things had their quirks. That first night, they slept soundly, the ticking of the clock the only lullaby. But at midnight, something happened. The clock's tick-tock, steady, predictable, suddenly faltered, then skipped. Rachel woke with a start, her eyes snapping open. She looked at the clock. The hands, which had been pointing to 12, suddenly jerked backward. The minute hand twitched, then slid past. The 11, then the 10, like a film reel played in reverse. "Dan," she whispered, but he was already awake, staring at the clock with a look of confusion on his face. "Did you see that?" He nodded slowly, his brow furrowing. The clock's ticking was growing louder, more insistent, and Rachel could have sworn the sound was coming from all around them, like the ticking was not just from the clock, but from the very air itself. The room grew cold. It wasn't just a drop in temperature. It was as if the air itself had turned stale, thick with the weight of something unnatural. The darkness outside the window pressed against the glass like a living thing. Then the ticking stopped, and the world tilted. The next morning when Rachel and Daniel woke, they were confused at first. It was only when they stepped into the living room and noticed that the furniture was slightly rearranged, just enough to make it seem like the room had shifted, that the unease settled in. It was as if something was off, like they were seeing the world through the wrong lens. Sarah was the first to notice. "Mom, I remember this, but I don't," she said, standing by the window. We didn't have that book on the shelf before." Rachel glanced at the shelf. Sure enough, there was a book she hadn't seen the day before, an old leather-bound volume, its pages yellowed and brittle. Daniel, still groggy, shook his head. "You're imagining things. We've been working all day trying to get this place set up. I'm sure it's just exhaustion." But Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. They went about their day. But as the evening drew on, the same sense of déjà vu kept gnawing at Rachel's thoughts. Every conversation, every movement felt rehearsed, like they were reliving the same moments over and over, but just slightly different, like a broken record skipping through time. And that night, at midnight, it happened again. The clock began to tick backward, its hands jerking violently against the natural flow of time. This time, it was more pronounced, louder, almost deafening. The world around them seemed to ripple, the air shimmering with an unnatural pressure, like the house Itself was breathing. Not again, Daniel muttered, staring at the clock in horror. This isn't possible. Rachel reached for the clock, but as soon as her fingers brushed the glass, a jolt of cold shot through her hand up her arm and straight into her chest. She gasped, stepping back. The air in the room felt thicker now, suffocating. And then the world shifted once more. When they woke the next morning, it was worse. The room was the same, but everything outside had changed. The trees in the yard had shifted places. The house that had been across the street was no longer there. Instead, a dilapidated, abandoned house stood in its place, a house that wasn't even on the map. Where did it go? Rachel asked, her voice trembling. The house across the street, it was there yesterday, wasn't it? But Daniel didn't have an answer. He was staring at the clock, now fixed on the wall as if it had always been there, its hands ticking backward with terrifying precision. The whispers started then. They were faint at first, just a murmur, like the sound of wind through trees, but as the night wore on, they grew louder. The house seemed to be breathing, exhaling with each tick of the clock, and with every breath came the whispers. At first, Rachel thought it was the wind again, but the sound wasn't random. It was distinct, deliberate, like something was trying to speak. And then, just as the clock struck midnight, the voices became clear. Time is not yours. Rachel recoiled. The voices were not coming from the clock. They were coming from inside the walls, beneath the floorboards, from everywhere. And they weren't just voices. They were cries, gasps of agony, of despair. The clock's hands jerked again, and this time Rachel could feel something watching them, waiting. The darkness in the room seemed to grow, thickening, pressing against them, as if it wanted to swallow them whole. They couldn't outrun it. The days became a blur, a cycle of waking and sleeping that repeated itself, each version of their life distorted, slightly more twisted than the last. Rachel tried to leave once, but as she crossed the threshold, she found herself standing in the same room again, the same walls, the same clock. The whispers were always there, and they were getting louder. They were begging now. Release us. They had no choice but to face the truth. The clock was controlling time, warping it. The curse was old, older than the house itself, and it had been passed down through generations. The clock wasn't just a timepiece. It was a prison, a way to trap souls, to trap time itself. It was the source of the house's malevolent power, and it would never let them leave. The clock was the key, the thing that controlled it all, and with every tick backward, the past, the true past, was creeping forward, trying to drag them into the nightmare. And in the end, they realized the terrible truth. There was no escaping it. The clock would keep ticking backward, always drawing them deeper into the past, until they were lost in the endless loop of torment and despair. As the hands of the clock inched closer to midnight, Rachel felt the pull of the darkness. Once again, stronger this time, and as the whispers grew louder, she knew it was too late. They had been trapped all along. The dollmaker's curse. Maggie hadn't expected to inherit much when her great-aunt Lydia passed away. The old woman had lived in the creaking house on Harrow Lane for as long as Maggie could remember, a place where dust seemed to settle into every corner and the air always felt too thick to breathe. Maggie hadn't seen the house in years, not since she was a little girl, and even then it had always felt wrong. A sense of foreboding clung to the place, the kind of atmosphere you could feel even before you stepped inside. Lydia, with her thin, pale face and sharp eyes, had always kept to herself, too strange, too reclusive to ever really be a part of the family. But when the lawyer's letter arrived, Maggie was told there were things left for her, things that might be worth something. She hadn't even thought to question what those things were. A house full of forgotten belongings, maybe some old jewelry, an heirloom or two, perhaps a few letters, faded and yellowed with time. What she didn't expect to find were the dolls. The collection sat in the attic, packed away in dusty boxes. When Maggie opened the first one, she felt a shiver run down her spine. The dolls were unlike anything she had ever seen. Each one was intricately made, so lifelike. Their glassy eyes seemed almost too real, their faces frozen in eternal, sorrowful expressions. Some had the look of old women, others of young men or children. Each doll was modeled after someone from her family's past, people Maggie had only heard about in stories, people who had died before she was even born. The most disturbing part was the way each doll seemed to know them, as if they were more than just painted porcelain and cloth. The first night, Maggie left the dolls in the attic. She had unpacked them carefully, placing them on the floor as the dusty air swirled around her. They were beautiful, she thought. Eerie, yes, but there was a certain craftsmanship to them that couldn't be denied. By the time she went to bed, the sense of unease she'd felt all afternoon had settled into something worse. Her dreams at night were filled with faces, familiar faces, but twisted, as though seen through the lens of some dark, foggy glass. There were smiles that weren't smiles, and eyes that didn't blink. It was the sound that woke her, a soft creaking, as though something was shifting. At first, she thought it was the house, old wood, old floors, the usual noises that came with age. But then she heard it, again, louder this time, like something heavy was dragging across the floor. Maggie sat up in bed, her heart pounding in her chest. The sound was coming from the attic. Her first instinct was to ignore it, but that was impossible. Curiosity, that dangerous thing that had haunted her since childhood, led her out of bed and up the stairs to the attic. The dolls were gone. They were not where she had left them. Some were lying face up on the floor, others standing, their heads turned at odd angles, their lifelike eyes fixed on her as she stepped into the room. The air felt colder, unnaturally so, as if the very temperature of the attic had dropped in a matter of moments. Maggie's heart raced in her chest. She reached for the nearest doll, an old woman with graying hair and a sad expression, and as her fingers brushed against its porcelain skin, she felt it, a cold, tingling sensation, as if the doll were alive under her touch. The eyes moved. She pulled her hand back in a sharp gasp, but the doll didn't fall. It just stared at her. The expression had changed, too. Now it was more than just sadness. There was a glimmer of something else there, something darker. Maggie stepped back, her legs shaking. She heard a soft whisper, faint but unmistakable. The voice was distant, like it came from the other side of the room, but it was clear. Enough! Help us! The dolls were moving. She saw them shift, their hands twitching, their heads tilting, toward her as if they were watching her, waiting for her. The air in the attic grew colder, still, and the faintest scent of old wood and dust mixed with something metallic, something foul. The whispers came again, growing louder. Help us! You've let us out! Her heart pounded as she stumbled backward. Her eyes locked on the dolls as they seemed to come to life before her eyes. The woman with the graying hair was standing, now, her tiny feet clicking on the floor. The young man, his face frozen in a permanent half-smile, was turning his head toward her. But the worst part was when Maggie saw it. The face of the man in the middle of the room, the one who looked too familiar. He had the same eyes as her. Great-Uncle Samuel, the one who died mysteriously years ago, his body never found, his disappearance never solved. But this man, this doll, had his face, and his eyes were watching her alive, the mouth curling into a twisted grin. "It's your turn, Maggie," the doll whispered. The horror of that moment settled into her bones like ice water. Maggie spun around and bolted out of the attic, her breath ragged in her chest. She ran down the stairs, not daring to look back, but she could feel them, all of them, staring at her. They were alive now, alive with the souls of those long dead. She locked the attic door behind her, her body trembling from head to toe, but the whispers didn't stop. They followed her wherever she went, echoing in the corners of her mind, in the spaces between her breaths. It wasn't long before Maggie discovered the truth. The dolls, each one, had once been family members, ancestors, and distant relatives whose lives had ended in violent, mysterious ways. The dolls had been created by her great-aunt Lydia, a woman with an unsettling obsession with death and the afterlife. It was no secret that Lydia had been deeply involved in occult practices, using her dolls as vessels for the trapped souls of the deceased, holding them in limbo. Now, Maggie understood what had happened. The souls had been set free, loose from their porcelain prisons when she had opened the attic door. And they weren't just lingering. They were hungry. They needed a new vessel. They wanted her. Days turned into weeks, and Maggie found herself trapped in the same cycle of horror. The dolls would move, always closer, always watching. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, more desperate, and every time she looked into their lifelike eyes, she could see the souls of those long dead, lost and desperate, searching for a way out. But there was no escape. As Maggie stood one night in the attic, facing the dolls, each one now positioned in a circle around her, their eyes glowing in the dim light, she realized with a sickening certainty that the curse wasn't just on the dolls. It was on her family. The curse had been passed down from one generation to the next, and now it was her turn. Her body stiffened as the first doll, Samuel, with his twisted grin, took a step forward. "Help us, join us." She didn't scream. She didn't have the strength. The last thing she saw was the doll's cold, lifeless eyes and then darkness. The dolls had found their new vessel, the echoing voices. The cabin was supposed to be an escape, a retreat from the noise of the world, a chance for the Turner family to reconnect. Sarah and David Turner, along with their two children, Emma and Jack, had searched for months for the perfect place, remote, peaceful, and far from the chaos of city life. The cabin, nestled deep in the woods of Maine, was just that, set on a quiet hill, surrounded by towering pines. It looked like a postcard, rustic, charming, and idyllic. It had been a rough year for the Turners. Between the pressures of work, the strain of everyday life, and the loss of Sarah's mother just 6 months prior, they needed time to heal, to rest, to reconnect. The family had been through enough. A weekend in the woods seemed like just a thing to put them back together. But it wasn't long before the cabin's solitude started to feel wrong. On the first night, after a simple dinner by the fire and a quiet game of cards, Sarah and David settled into bed, the flickering of the fireplace casting long shadows against the walls. Emma and Jack, both under 10, were already asleep in the adjacent room there, breathing soft and steady. For a while, the house was still, the only sound the occasional creak of the wood settling beneath the weight of time. Then came the first voice, a faint whisper, just barely audible, but unmistakable. Sarah's name. At first, she thought it was her imagination. She turned over in bed, half smiling to herself. It had been a long drive to get here, and she was still adjusting to the quiet of the forest. But the whisper came again, louder this time, Sarah. It was clear, unmistakable. "David, did you hear that?" she asked, sitting up in bed, her heart rate quickening. David mumbled something in his sleep, and she nudged him again, more forcefully this time. He groaned and rolled over, muttering, "What is it?" "The voice," she whispered, her eyes scanning the darkness outside the bedroom. Window. I heard someone call my name. David rubbed his eyes, looking at her with a mixture of confusion and exhaustion. You're probably just tired. It's probably the wind or... Sarah. The voice cut through the air again, louder this time, and unmistakably her name. It was... Close. Too close. Did you hear that? Sarah asked, her voice tight now. Her pulse quickened and unexplainable dread creeping into her chest. David's face darkened. He listened, straining against the silence. It's probably just the wind, he repeated, though his voice had lost its certainty. But Sarah knew. She had heard something. Over the next few days, the voices became a persistent presence in the cabin. At first, it was just Sarah's name, whispered from the trees. But soon, the voices began calling too. The others, David, Emma, Jack, each name as clear as the next. The family thought it was their minds playing tricks. After all, they were in a strange place, far from civilization. The forest was full of strange sounds. But then the voices began mimicking their own, not just calling their names, but repeating their words. One afternoon, while Sarah and David were chopping wood by the fire pit, they heard it. Again. David, Sarah called, her voice edged with frustration. Can you hand me the axe? The response came almost immediately, a voice that was so exactly like hers that it stopped Sarah in her tracks. Can you hand me the axe? She froze, the wood falling from her hands. The voice was hers, too much like hers, coming from the edge of the woods. She turned to David, her face pale. Did you hear that? She whispered. David stared at her for a long moment before responding. It's nothing. Just the echo, the way the sound bounces in the trees. But even he couldn't shake the chill that crawled up his spine. Later that night, after they had settled into bed, the voices came again. This time they were louder, not whispers, shouts, and not just one voice. It was Emma's voice calling for her mother. Mom, Mom, help me. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she shot up from the bed, her heart slamming in her chest. Emma, she shouted, scrambling out of the blankets. But when she opened the door to the children's room, there was nothing. Only Emma and Jack, fast asleep, unaware of the distress their mother had felt. The voices outside the cabin didn't stop. They never stopped. Emma, Mom, help me. As the days passed, the voices began to change, becoming more sinister. They weren't just mimicking their voices anymore. They were taking on the voices of those they had lost. It started with Sarah's mother, her soft, comforting voice now calling out from the woods. Sarah, it's me. I'm here. Then, the voice of David's father, dead for 2 years now, murmured across the dark expanse of trees. David, come. I'm waiting for you. And it was then that the family realized the truth. These weren't just echoes of their past. These were voices drawing them in. The deeper into the woods they went, the stronger the voices became. They heard the sound of their own footsteps as if they were walking alongside them, but when they turned around, there was nothing. But the voices, they were still there, always there. On the 5th night, after days of hearing nothing but the voices calling their name, Sarah could no longer ignore the pull. Something was out there, something that had been waiting. It was like a slow wave, inching toward them, pulling at their hearts and minds. She could hear her mother's voice calling her, the sweetness of it blending with the deep, insistent call of her own name. Without realizing it, Sarah had left the cabin. She walked through the woods, following the voices, drawn to the place where she felt the pressure build in her chest, the place where the voices never stopped. It wasn't until she reached the clearing that she saw it, a figure standing in the center of the woods, A shadow among shadows. It looked like her mother. No, it was her mother. "Sarah, come home," the figure whispered. But when Sarah took a step forward, the figure grinned, wide, too wide, and its eyes began to bleed. That's when Sarah realized it wasn't her mother at all. It was something else, something that wanted her. The next morning, the Turners were gone. No trace remained except the faintest whisper. On the wind, the cabin stood empty once again, the trees rustling in the breeze. And if you listen carefully, when the wind is right, you might hear the voices calling from the woods. They never leave. The fading family portrait. It hung over the mantelpiece like a sentinel, watching the Fairchild family day and night. The portrait had been commissioned nearly a century ago by Eleanora Fairchild, the family matriarch, who insisted it was important to preserve the family's legacy. "Your faces must remain here," she'd written in a letter preserved with the painting, "for as long as the Fairchild line exists." The painting itself was beautiful in a way that only old things can be, warm, muted. Tones, intricate brushwork. It depicted the current generation of the Fairchilds, Eleanor's descendants, pose in their Sunday best, the background a hazy swirl of soft blues and greens. But what drew the most attention was how lifelike the faces were. It wasn't just a resemblance. It was uncanny, as though the artist had somehow painted their very essence onto the canvas. At first, it was nothing more than a family heirloom, admired but largely ignored, until the day the youngest child, Evie, noticed the first change. "Mom," she said, standing in front of the fireplace, "why does Uncle Dan look fuzzy?" At first, they thought it was just a light. The fireplace had been lit, and the flickering flames might have cast strange shadows across the painting. But when the family examined it closer, there was no denying it. Uncle Dan's face had faded, his features blurred and indistinct, as though someone had begun to erase him with an invisible hand. "Maybe it's just old," said Linda, Evie's mother. "Or bad varnish," her husband Rick added. "We'll get it restored." But the restoration never happened, because 2 days later, Dan Fairchild had a heart attack. The family gathered at the hospital, waiting for news. The doctor finally emerged with a grim expression. "He's lucky to be alive," he said. "We nearly lost him." No one mentioned the portrait that day, but when Linda and Rick returned home, they stood before it in silence, staring at the faint outline where Dan's face had once been. The next morning, it wasn't just Dan. Linda's face was the next to fade. Her features softened, losing their sharpness, like a photograph left too long in the sun. Rick noticed it first and called her into the room, his voice trembling. "Look," he said, pointing. "That's not possible," she whispered. That night, Linda woke gasping for air, her chest tight. It felt as though something was sitting on her, pressing the life out of her. Rick drove her to the hospital, where the doctors diagnosed a severe allergic reaction. "But I haven't eaten anything unusual," she protested, her voice weak. The doctor shrugged. "Sometimes these things just happen." Rick didn't believe it. By the end of the week, 2 more faces had begun to fade, Evie's and Rick's. The family no longer felt safe in their own home. Linda wanted to leave, to pack their things and never look back. But Rick was convinced they had to figure out what was happening. "It's the portrait," he said. Linda stared at him. "Do you hear yourself?" "It's a painting, Rick. Paintings don't do things." But as she spoke, she felt the faintest pull toward the mantelpiece, as though the portrait was listening. Desperate, Rick began researching the family's history. He pored through old letters, journals, anything that might explain the painting's connection to their sudden misfortunes. He found the answer in one of Eleanora Fairchild's diaries, hidden in a locked trunk in the attic. "Blood binds us," Eleanora had written. This portrait ensures the family's survival. But the bond is not one-sided. The painting must be cared for, or it will take what it needs. Rick's blood ran cold. What does that mean? Linda asked when he showed her the passage. I think it's feeding off us, Rick said. If the painting fades, so do we. The family tried everything. They polished the glass, adjusted the frame, even attempted to repaint the faded sections, but the changes never lasted. The more they meddled, the faster the faces faded. Evie grew pale and lethargic, her laughter replaced by quiet whimpers. Linda was constantly weak, as though a heavy weight were pressing down on her. And Rick began to feel it too, a gnawing exhaustion that no amount of sleep could cure. The painting, on the other hand, seemed more vibrant than ever. The colors glowed and the background details sharpened, as though it was growing stronger while they weakened. In the end, Rick made a decision. It's the only way, he said, holding a can of kerosene. Linda's eyes widened. You can't burn it. What if it kills us? It's killing us anyway. That night, after Evie had fallen asleep, Rick doused the portrait in kerosene and struck a match. For a moment, the flames danced harmlessly across the canvas, and Rick thought it wasn't going to work. But then the fire took hold, roaring to life. The faces in the painting seemed to twist, the faint outlines writhing as though in agony. And then it was gone, reduced to ash. The family never spoke of the portrait again. Over time, their health returned, though. None of them could shake the feeling that something was missing, a shadow hanging over them just out of reach. Years later, Evie, now grown, visited an art gallery in a nearby town. There, hanging on the wall, was a portrait that looked eerily familiar. A family she didn't recognize, but whose faces glowed with life. In the corner of the painting, almost imperceptibly, was a faint, ghostly figure. It was her father, Rick Fairchild, his features blurred, his eyes wide with silent warning. The forgotten photograph. The box sat in the attic, forgotten, covered in dust, the kind of dust that spoke of years, decades, maybe, of neglect. It was the sort of box you only discover when you're searching for something else, when your hands and your curiosity are restless, and your mind refuses to let go of the past. Ethan Harris didn't mean to go through it. Really, he didn't. He'd only gone up to the attic to grab a couple of old camping chairs for a family get-together. The box, wedged between an old dresser and a dusty pile of unused furniture, had caught his eye. A box, labeled in faded marker, family memorabilia. It wasn't that Ethan was especially nostalgic. It's just that he'd never been to the attic of the house since his father passed. His mother, long gone, had kept it locked away, keeping memories wrapped in tissue paper and sealed in crates. But now that his father had died, the house was his to do with as he pleased, though he was often unsure whether that was a gift or a curse. He had never been close to his father, but there was something about the house, about the way his father's presence lingered in the corners, in the smell of old wood, in the creaking of the floors. There was something hauntingly familiar and perhaps even unsettling about it all. Ethan took the box down to the kitchen, placed it on the table, and began to sift through its contents. A few old birthday cards, a tarnished medal from his father's days in the Navy, a handful of black and white photographs, faces he didn't quite recognize. The photo that caught his attention, however, was an unusual one. It was a group photograph, taken sometime in the 1940s, or so it seemed. The people in it were dressed in old-fashioned clothing, their faces smiling, frozen in a moment that Ethan could not place. There were about 10 people in the picture, family, perhaps, or old friends, but one of them didn't belong. The figure stood at the far side of the group, just behind his father, a man he didn't recognize. The figure's face was strangely out of focus, like the photo had been rushed. or the exposure was wrong, but there was something more to it. Something wrong in the way the figure stood there. His presence felt out of place, as though he had never been, meant to be captured, never meant to be seen at all. Ethan stared at the man, his stomach churning with a sense of unease he couldn't explain. It wasn't just the figure's unusual positioning, or the fact that he was slightly out of focus. There was something about his eyes. The figure's eyes, dark and empty, seemed to be staring directly at Ethan, as if the person in the photograph knew he was there, knew he was watching. You're not supposed to be here. The thought hit Ethan like a cold wave, though he couldn't say where it had come from. He had never been superstitious, never believed in the paranormal, but there was something chilling in that moment. Something about the photograph made his skin crawl. The first night, it was nothing. A quiet evening. Ethan tucked the photograph back in the box, shoved the box back in the attic, and went to bed. But as he lay in the dark, he felt the pull of something just out of reach, just beyond his senses, but undeniably there. And then, in the early hours of the morning, he woke with a start. His room was cold, colder than it should have been, and the air around him seemed to hum with a strange energy. It was a photograph, wasn't it? The figure, the eyes. Ethan pushed the thought away, rolled over, and tried to fall back asleep, but something was different. Something was wrong. The next day, as Ethan went about his routine, he felt it again, a prickling sensation at the back of his neck. The hairs on his arms stood up as if someone were watching him, and each time he passed a reflective surface, he thought he saw the faintest distortion in the glass, a flicker, a blur, just for a moment, like the air had been disturbed. That night, when he returned to the attic to pull out a few more items from the box, he found it. The photograph was no longer where he'd left it. It had been moved slightly. The edges of the photograph were curled, as though someone had touched it. But the strangest thing was that the figure in the photograph had changed. He had moved. The out-of-focus man, once standing behind his father, was now just a little closer to the camera, his face a little clearer, his eyes darker, deeper. The eyes that had once seemed like empty pits now glowed faintly, like tiny embers, and they were looking at him, staring directly at him. The days passed, but the photographs grew more unsettling. Ethan, unable to pull his mind away from it, began to investigate. He pored over old family albums, old letters, anything that might explain the man in the photo. He asked his father's friends, his relatives. No one knew who the man was, but they all agreed on one thing. The photograph had never existed in the family's collection before. It was as if the man in the picture had simply appeared, somehow, somewhere, outside of time and memory. And then the dream started. Ethan couldn't remember them in full when he woke, only fragments, dark figures, standing in the corners of rooms, a soft whisper of a name he didn't know, a feeling of being watched. But the one thing he could remember was a sensation of something pulling at him, urging him to step closer, to reach for the photo, to see the face that wasn't meant to be seen. The more Ethan looked at it, the more the figure in the photo changed. The man grew, clearer, more distinct, his features sharpening like the photograph was coming to life. His eyes, once faint and ghostly, now seemed to shine with an unnatural light. It was no longer a simple photograph. It was a portal. The voices started then, whispers in the dark, just out of reach, growing louder each night. Come closer. Look at me. Come. You're meant to see. Ethan couldn't stop himself. He pulled the photograph from the box one last time drawn, like a moth to the flame. His fingers trembled as he touched the edges of the photo, his pulse quickening as he stared into the face of the man who didn't belong, the man whose face had never been meant to be seen. The moment Ethan's fingers brushed the photograph, the world around him seemed to crack. The room went cold. The shadows deepened. And the man in the photo, the one who had never been there before, stepped out from the edges of the frame. He stepped forward into the room, and his face was there, real, solid, in front of Ethan. The last thing Ethan saw before the darkness took him was the man's eyes, dark, endless, and hollow. The photograph had been his ticket in, and now Ethan was part of it. The photograph remains in the attic, where no one dares to touch it. No one dares to look at it. The figure, once a blur, now watches the world through the cracked glass of a forgotten frame, waiting, forever waiting. And if you ever find the photograph, tucked away in an old box of memories, be careful. The face in the photograph may not just be watching you. It may want to be you. The forgotten prayer. Ben and Claire had never planned on spending their Saturday morning at the yard sale. It was a kind of impulse decision that felt harmless, a break from the usual routine. The sun hung high in the sky, casting a warm, golden light across the sleepy suburban street. It had rained the night before, and the air smelled fresh, tinged with the earthy scent of damp grass. Claire had always loved a good bargain, and Ben didn't mind indulging her. They were newlyweds, still finding their way through the ups and downs of life together. And these small moments of spontaneity had become a quiet comfort in their otherwise predictable world. As they wandered through the rows of tables, picking through old furniture and knickknacks, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But then, near the back of the yard, something caught Claire's eye. An old book. It was tucked in the corner of a weathered table, its leather cover cracked with age, the title faded and nearly illegible. The Book of Providence, the words barely visible beneath, the layers of dust and time. Claire felt a strange pull toward it, like the book was calling to her. It wasn't that it looked particularly special. Old, yes, but not out of place in a yard sale filled with forgotten things. Yet, there was something about it, something unsettling. What do you think? Claire asked, turning to Ben, who was inspecting a set of silver spoons. He glanced over, shrugged. Could be interesting. Looks ancient, though. You sure you want to lug that home? I don't know, she said, tracing her fingers along the edges of the book. It feels important, like it belongs with us. Ben raised an eyebrow, a half-smile playing on his lips. Important? It's just a book. But Claire didn't listen. She paid the vendor, an elderly woman with a vacant look in her eyes, and with the book in her hands, she felt a strange, almost surreal sense of victory, as though she'd found something that had been waiting for her, something that had been lost for a long time. At home, Ben made coffee, and Claire curled up on the couch with her new acquisition, flipping through its yellowed pages. It was a strange book, part religious text, part history, filled with obscure passages and references to things she didn't recognize. As she read, the air in the room seemed to thicken, the words on the page swirling in her vision, becoming more and more disjointed as though they were alive. Then, on a page near the back, she found it, a prayer. It was written in a language she couldn't place, but somehow, as she stared at it, the words seemed to seep into her mind. They felt familiar, as though she had heard them before, or perhaps had known them in a dream. She hesitated for a moment, her fingers hovering over the page. It felt wrong, dangerous even, but curiosity gnawed at her. A compulsion she couldn't shake. Claire began to read the prayer aloud. The words were slow at first, each syllable heavy, like stones rolling down a hill. But as she spoke, a cold draft swept through the room, chilling the air despite the warmth of the sunlight. The lights flickered, and for a brief moment, the floor beneath her feet seemed to tremble. Her voice faltered, but she pushed on, the words slipping from her tongue, without thinking, as though something was urging her forward. As soon as the final syllable left her lips, a silence fell over the room. The kind of silence that makes your ears ring. The air grew still, but something felt off, like the world itself had shifted just a little bit in a way that was hard to explain. Ben came into the living room, his face tense. What happened? The lights flickered. You... Okay. Claire put the book down, staring at it as if it might suddenly spring to life. I don't. No. I just read something. You should have stopped, Ben said, his voice sharp. There's something about that book. Something weird. I don't like it. But Claire didn't listen. She was already turning the pages again, her fingers trembling as she searched for something. She didn't know what. She was just drawn to it, as if the book itself had a magnetic pull, as if it was beckoning her towards something darker, something hidden within its pages. The first thing Ben noticed was how the house began to feel different. It wasn't an immediate change, but it was there, lurking beneath the surface. The air in the hallway seemed thicker or heavier, as though the walls were pressing in on them. The windows, once clear and bright, now felt foggy, as if the sunlight had been dimmed by something unseen. At night, Claire would wake up suddenly, her heart racing, drenched in sweat, convinced that something was moving in the shadows. Sometimes she would hear whispers, faint, unintelligible whispers, coming from the corners of the room or from behind the walls, as though the house itself was alive, breathing in time with her own pulse. And then came the dreams. At first, they were just dreams, distorted, half-remembered things that left her with a lingering sense of dread. But soon, the dreams became more vivid, more real. In one, Claire was standing in a vast empty field, the sky swirling above her like a storm. A figure, dark, shrouded in shadow, stood in the distance, watching her. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure moved closer, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. And when it reached out to touch her, her skin burned with the coldness of its fingers. Claire woke up gasping for air, but the feeling didn't leave. The terror clung to her even when she was awake, when the sun shone brightly through the windows. And then the changes in the house started to become harder to ignore. The mirrors no longer reflected her image clearly. The floors creaked in strange patterns, footsteps where there should have been none. And Ben was changing too. His eyes grew dark, hollowed out, as if some part of him had slipped away, leaving only an empty shell. And then the photograph started to show it. The first photo Claire took of Ben, his face was wrong. It wasn't just that he looked different. It was the absence in his eyes, the hollow space where his soul should have been. But when she took another photo, the presence in the background grew clearer. A shadow, not quite human, standing just behind him. The shadow of a thing that shouldn't have been there. Ben, she whispered one night, holding the photo in her trembling hands. Look at this. He turned, his eyes cold and distant. It's nothing, Claire. Stop. We should burn the book. But it was too late. The words had already been spoken, and the spirit, whatever it was, had already taken root. They had invited it in. It was no longer just a prayer. It was a curse. In the weeks that followed, their lives began to unravel. The lines between the real and the unreal blurred, distorted by the malevolent force that had been unleashed. The prayer Claire had spoken had done more than just summon a spirit. It had opened a doorway, a portal between this world and the one beyond. The dark spirit that inhabited the house twisted everything it touched, feeding on fear, manipulating time, and warping reality itself. Ben no longer looked like Ben. He had become a shadow of the man she married, his face pale and gaunt, his movements stiff and robotic. It was as if he were fading little by little, as though something inside him had been drained away. Claire tried to break free, tried to leave, but the house wouldn't let them go. Every door they tried to open led them back into the same rooms. Every window they looked out of revealed the same endless, darkened landscape. The book had become their prison, and the spirit had become their jailer. Claire realized too late that the prayer wasn't a call for help. It was a summons, a summoning to something dark and ancient, something that had waited for centuries, trapped between worlds, waiting for the right moment to break free. And now it had them. The last photo Claire took before everything went black was a blurry image of herself and Ben, their faces distorted, their bodies stretched, the shadow of the spirit looming just. Behind them, its eyes glowing, watching, waiting. And the prayer continued to echo in the house, a whisper on the wind, a curse that would never be broken. The haunted quilt. The quilt wasn't supposed to feel alive. It wasn't supposed to be warm like flesh, soft like a lullaby. But when Jenny McAllister draped it across her shoulders that first night, she felt something, an almost imperceptible tremor, as if the fabric itself was breathing. Jenny's family had found the quilt in a cedar chest at a flea market off Route 22. It was folded neatly, its patterns mismatched but strangely compelling. There were patches of deep crimson stitched beside faded floral prints, starburst shapes next to dull gray, squares, and at its center, a single white square embroidered with looping black thread. The seller, a wiry man with nicotine-stained fingers and eyes too old for his face, had hesitated when her husband, Bill, asked the price. $5, the man said after a pause, but his voice trembled as if he regretted the number the moment it left his lips. Jenny didn't think much of it then, just another odd relic to bring a little warmth to their new farmhouse, she thought. But warmth was the wrong word for it. The quilt didn't just warm, it radiated, it pulsed. That night, as the snow howled against their windows and the fire sputtered low in the hearth, Jenny draped the quilt over herself and drifted to sleep on the couch. She woke gasping. The dream, the nightmare, was too vivid to shake. She was in a field, the air heavy with a metallic stench of blood. A man stood before her, his back turned. His hands were clasped behind him, and his head tilted as if listening to something distant. Then, suddenly he spun around, and his face, his face, was a mask of terror, his eyes bulging, mouth stretched in a silent scream. Jenny bolted upright. The quilt tangled around her. Her skin was clammy, her heartbeat erratic. She told herself it was nothing. Stress. Moving into the farmhouse had been exhausting. She tossed the quilt aside and went to bed, not noticing how one crimson square seemed brighter now, as if freshly dyed. By the next night, Bill was curious about the quilt. Cold tonight, he said, pulling it across his lap. Jenny started to protest, a strange unease bubbling in her chest. But Bill laughed it off. What you hogging it all for? Yourself? That night, Jenny was awoken by his screams. I was in a car, he stammered, his face pale, his eyes darting like a trapped animal. It crashed. I could feel the metal slicing through me, Jenny. I could feel it. She tried to comfort him, but he wouldn't touch the quilt again. The days passed, and the quilt stayed folded on the edge of the couch, untouched. But Jenny couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching her. She began to notice things. How the pattern seemed to shift when she wasn't looking. How the white square in the center looked dirtier, smudged with grayish streaks. One night, their son, Charlie, a curious 9-year-old, wrapped himself in the quilt while watching cartoons. Charlie, no! Jenny screamed, but it was too late. That night, he woke up crying, clutching his chest. I was falling, Mom, he whispered, off a building. It was so high, and I couldn't stop it. Jenny inspected the quilt after Charlie fell back asleep. One of the squares now bore a faint outline of a figure plummeting through the air. By the end of the week, Jenny couldn't deny it any longer. Each square told a story, a tragedy. The crimson one was a stabbing, the floral patch a poisoning, the starburst a fiery explosion. Each dream was more vivid, more real than the last. But it was the white square at the center that haunted her most. It was changing, darkening. Shapes were forming. Human figures, maybe. Faces. She did what anyone would do. She tried to burn it. Bill watched as she shoved a quilt into the fireplace, her hands trembling. The flames roared to life, engulfing the fabric in seconds. But instead of curling and blackening, the quilt writhed, twisting as if in agony. And then came the screams, voices, dozens of them, echoing through the room, pleading, sobbing, shrieking. The fire died out in an instant, and the quilt lay untouched, pristine. The quilt grew heavier after that, and the dreams came even when no one slept beneath it. Jenny saw visions in the corners of her eyes, shadowy figures lingering near the quilt, their faces hollow, their eyes pits of despair. In her desperation, Jenny returned to the flea market. She found a wiry man in the same spot, his cigarette smoldering between shaky fingers. "You've seen it, haven't you?" he said before she could speak. "What is it?" Jenny asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The man looked away, his face pale. "It's a graveyard," he muttered. "Each square, someone's soul, their pain, their death. And the white square? That one's waiting for the next story, for the next victim." Jenny didn't sleep that night. She sat by the quilt, staring at the white square as it grew, darker and darker. She swore she saw her own reflection in the black threads, screaming, silently. And by morning, the white square was gone. In its place, a new pattern, a faded floral print, stitched together with crimson thread. And Jenny's side of the bed was empty. The quilt still sits in the farmhouse, waiting for the next family, the next tragedy. Each square tells a story, but the white one's always waiting. The lantern in the fog. The town of Havenport was like a dream, the kind you can never quite remember, but the feeling of it lingers long after you've woken up. It wasn't the kind of place where people came for vacation. It wasn't a bustling coastal town, not like the ones you see in travel brochures with vibrant boardwalks and crowded cafes. No, Havenport was small tucked, away on the northern edge of Maine's coast, where the fog came in thick from the ocean, and the wind carried secrets that the town itself tried to forget. When the Reed family moved there in the fall of 1997, they didn't know any of this. They were just looking for a fresh start. After the death of Emily's mother, the loss of their old life, it seemed like the perfect place to rebuild. Emily and Thomas, along with their two children, Ryan and Lily, found a house at the edge of town, an old cottage perched on a hill overlooking the craggy coastline. It was peaceful, isolated, and just what they needed. The locals were quiet, friendly enough, but distant. They didn't say much about the past, about the land or the sea. The fog, they warned, could be treacherous. But then again, everything was. It was just the way things were in Havenport. The first night they arrived, Emily was already unsettled by the eerie quiet of it all. The air smelled different here, salty, but there was something else to it, something heavier. And the fog, thick as molasses, swallowing everything whole. As the family unpacked in their new home, the wind howled outside, rattling the windows. But no one mentioned it aloud. They all had their own thoughts, their own uneasy feelings. By the second night, the fog had thickened even more, the kind that didn't seem natural, the kind that didn't lift, no matter how far the morning sun stretched. Around dusk, as the light faded and the shadows swallowed the land, Emily noticed it for the first time. A lantern, a light flickering in the distance, out there in the fog. At first, she thought it was just her imagination. Perhaps someone had left a light on the cliffside, or maybe a fisherman's boat was out, casting its lantern light through the mist. But there was something off about it. It wasn't moving like a normal lantern would. It hovered, suspended in the fog, unmoving, as if it had no owner. No person was walking, no boat was passing by. It was simply there, glowing faintly against the oppressive darkness. "Thomas," Emily called out softly, her voice low. "Do you see that?" Thomas, who had been unpacking a box of dishes, looked out the window. He squinted, as if trying to make sense of the scene. He didn't say anything at first. "I see it," he muttered finally, shaking his head. "Strange place. Must be a lighthouse or something." But the light was too far out in the fog for it to be a lighthouse, and it didn't move the way a light would from a boat. It just stood there, suspended, beckoning them somehow. "Should we check it out?" Emily asked, her voice betraying an edge of nervous excitement. Ryan and Lily, sitting on the couch in the living room, didn't seem to notice the strange glow. They were more concerned with the newness of their surroundings, the excitement of having a whole new place to explore. But Emily couldn't stop watching the light. It flickered, briefly disappearing into the fog, before reappearing brighter now. Her breath caught in her throat. There was something pulling her toward it, something almost magnetic. "Mom, I'm going to bed," Ryan said, suddenly appearing behind her. Emily snapped out of her trance, her heart pounding in her chest. She smiled at him, but the chill still lingered in the air. The lantern had vanished from her sight, replaced by only the thick, gray fog. The next evening, the lantern was back, this time closer. It was brighter now almost, pulsing with an odd, rhythmical glow. This time, Emily and Thomas both saw it there, eyes drawn to it in the same way. It wasn't just the glow of a lantern anymore. It was something more, something ancient, like it had always been there, calling to them. "Do you think it's real?" Emily asked quietly, feeling a shiver run down her spine. "I don't know," Thomas answered, voice distant. "But there's something about it that feels wrong." The days passed, and each night the lantern returned. Sometimes it was farther out, at the edge of the cliffs, and sometimes it was closer, near the woods at the foot of the hill. But every night it flickered, pulling at their attention, drawing them in. It wasn't long before the strange occurrences began. Ryan was the first to notice it. The family had taken a walk down to the beach one afternoon, the fog hanging thick over the sand, when he stopped suddenly, his hand gripping his mother's arm. "I heard something," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Voices? What kind of voices?" Emily asked, kneeling down to his level. Ryan shook his head, eyes wide. "Old voices. People calling out. They're not from here." And then there were the shifts in time. The first time it happened, Emily thought it was a mistake. She had walked outside to get some fresh air and found herself back in the same spot she had started from, her watch showing a different time. Minutes had passed, but the sun was in the wrong place, the shadows all wrong. Thomas, too, had experienced it once. He had driven into town to grab groceries and found himself driving down the same road 3 times in a row, all while the same fog rolled in and out, as though time was bending and warping around them. His hands had clenched the wheel, his knuckles white. And the worst part, the more they tried to avoid it, the more the fog followed them. It wasn't until the 4th night, when Emily and Thomas decided to venture out into the fog, that they realized the truth. They were drawn toward the lantern, as if it were the only thing in the world that mattered. They stumbled toward it through the fog, their breath coming in sharp gasps, when suddenly they heard it, the voices, whispers low and insistent, and then a sharp, guttural cry. Do not follow the light. It was an old man's voice, ragged, desperate. They turned to see nothing but thick, swirling mist. The lantern, now blindingly bright, stood just a few feet away. But something was off. It wasn't floating anymore. It was moving, like someone was holding it, walking toward them through the fog. And the fog, it was moving with purpose, encircling them, closing in. You are already lost. The voice whispered again, louder this time. The ground beneath their feet shifted, the landscape warping and distorting. What had once been a quiet stretch of land had become a twisted, nightmarish landscape of half-familiar places, streets that didn't exist, houses that weren't theirs, people that had died long ago, all staring at them with hollow eyes. In that moment, Emily realized with horrifying clarity that the lantern wasn't just a light. It was a trap, a manifestation of something ancient, something that had long cursed the town of Havenport, a curse that, if you followed it, would steal your soul and leave you, wandering in the fog forever. And they weren't the first to follow. No one ever saw the Reed family again. The house stood empty, the lantern still flickering, in the fog every evening, waiting for the next to fall prey to its call. Some say the voices still echo through the mist, calling to those who pass by. Don't follow the lantern. It is the last warning you will ever hear. The mask that smiles. The mask was the first thing Julia noticed when she stepped into the antique shop. It hung on the far wall, half hidden among a collection of dusty paintings and tarnished sconces. Its surface was pale porcelain, smooth and flawless, with painted red lips, curled into a delicate, almost coy smile. "What about that?" she asked the shopkeeper, an elderly woman with a frizz of white hair, and eyes that gleamed too brightly for the dim lighting. "That?" The woman hesitated, her voice cracking on the word. "That's not for sale." Julia tilted her head, intrigued. "Then why is it on display?" The woman hesitated, glancing at the mask like it was something venomous. "Some things just belong where they are." Julia wasn't the type to take no for an answer. An hour later, she was carrying the mask out of the shop, wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. The shopkeeper hadn't argued much after Julia offered twice the asking price of an old phonograph. She just handed it over with trembling hands and a whispered, "Be careful." Julia didn't think much of it. She liked strange, beautiful things, and the mask was both. She decided to hang it in the hallway of her small apartment, opposite the mirror. That first night, she caught herself staring at it. The smile seemed wider than she remembered, the lips curving just a little higher at the corners. "That's ridiculous," she muttered to herself, turning off the hallway light. The dream started the next night. Julia was in a room she didn't recognize. White walls, no windows. The mask was on the wall in front of her, but it wasn't still. The lips moved, curling into a grin that stretched impossibly wide. "Wear me," the mask whispered. She woke in a cold sweat, the words ringing in her ears. Over the next week, Julia began to notice strange things. The mask smile seemed to grow wider every day, and the porcelain shimmered faintly in the light as though it was alive. When she passed it in the hallway, she felt its pull, an almost magnetic sensation, drawing her gaze. She tried to ignore it, but every time she looked at the mask, her hands twitched, itching to touch it, to hold it, to wear it. She told herself she was imagining things, but the mask had other ideas. One evening, Julia's friend Lisa came over. "That thing's creepy," Lisa said, eyeing the mask as they sat in the living room. Julia shrugged. "It's just a mask." Lisa frowned. "I don't know. It looks different." "Different how?" "Like it's smiling at me." Julia laughed, but her stomach twisted. That night, Julia couldn't sleep. The apartment felt too quiet, too still. She got up for A, glass of water, and found herself standing in the hallway, staring at the mask. Its smile was impossibly wide now, stretching nearly to the edges of the porcelain. The painted eyes, once lifeless, seemed to glitter in the dim light. "Wear me," it whispered, though the room was empty. Her hand reached out before she could stop it. The mask was cold against her skin at first, but it warmed quickly, molding itself to her, face like a second skin. She felt a surge of energy, a rush of euphoria so intense it made her gasp, and then the mask began to tighten. She clawed at it, trying to pull it off, but it wouldn't budge. The edges of the porcelain sank into her skin, fusing with flesh. She stumbled to the mirror, her reflection distorted and strange. The mask's grin was her grin now, and it stretched wider and wider, splitting her cheeks, open like a grotesque wound. "Inside," she screamed, but outside, the mask only smiled. Lisa found Julia's apartment empty the next morning, the front door ajar. The mask was gone from the wall. Months later, it turned up in another antique shop, its smile as serene and inviting as ever, and it waited, because the mask always finds someone, and once it does, it never lets go. The portrait in the hall. The Markham family had never planned on moving to the old manor, but when the opportunity arose, they couldn't resist. The house was sprawling, imposing, and sat at the edge of the small, forgotten town of Barrows Hollow. It had stood there for generations, slowly crumbling under the weight of time, its windows dusty and its front door creaking with every gust of wind. The family, James, Alice, and their young son, Luke, saw it as a chance to escape the grind of city life, a place where they could breathe, where they could forget the world's chaos. When they first entered the manor, it was as they'd imagined, dark with the scent of old wood and mildew filling the air. The rooms were grand but worn, the wallpaper peeling in places, the floors creaking beneath their feet as if the house was still settling, still waking from its long slumber. But there was something else too, something unexplainable, a strange, oppressive feeling in the air, as if the house had been waiting for them. They started their unpacking and settling in, exploring the dusty old rooms one by one. But it was in the hallway, just beyond the main living room, where they found it. The portrait was an imposing thing. It hung on the wall at the end of the hallway, its frame, thick and ornate, as though it had been there for centuries. But the strange thing was, none of them remembered seeing it before. James could have sworn the wall had been bare when they first arrived. Alice hadn't noticed it during the initial walkthrough either, but there it was now, hanging in the dim light of the hallway, a somber painting of a man. In an old-fashioned suit, his eyes dark and cold, his expression severe. The man in the portrait was staring directly at them. His face, chiseled and sharp, had a certain coldness to it, as if his soul had long ago been drained, leaving behind nothing but a shell. He wore a dark vest and a high-collared shirt, the fabric of his clothing thick and heavy, a style that had long been out of fashion. His hands, clasped in front of him, looked as though they were holding something, though when James tried to focus, he realized there was nothing there. For a few days, they thought little of the portrait, dismissing it as just another relic of the house's age. But slowly, over time, something began to change. The first sign was subtle. At night, when the house grew quiet and the wind began to howl outside, Alice would hear faint footsteps in the hallway. It was as if someone was walking just out of reach, but when she would get up to investigate, no one would be there. She told James about it, but he just chalked it up to the house settling. After all, it was an old place, full of creaks and groans. Then came the whispers. At first, it was just a faint murmur, like a voice carried on the wind, so soft she couldn't make out the words. But soon, it grew louder, clearer, low, rasping murmurs that seemed to come from all around her. She'd hear them at night, lying in bed, and sometimes, even when she was in the kitchen, Alice would get up, feeling a shiver crawl down her spine, and walk the house, but she found nothing, just empty rooms and dust-covered furniture. Luke, too, began to feel it. At first, it was just little things. He would refuse to walk past the hallway, claiming the man in the painting was watching him. His imagination, they thought. But one night, after returning from an outing, they found him in the hallway, frozen, staring at the portrait with wide, terrified eyes. When they asked what was wrong, he simply whispered. He moved. At first they dismissed it, but then they started to notice something unsettling. Each morning, when James or Alice would walk past the painting, the man's expression had subtly shifted. His eyes would follow them. First a glance over his shoulder, then a shift of his mouth into a thin, mocking smile. But it wasn't just his expression. The figure seemed to grow more lifelike, more real. It was as if he was coming out of the painting, inch by inch, pulling himself free from the confines of the canvas. And that was when things began to truly unravel. One evening, as the house settled into its usual silence, James stood alone in the hallway. He hadn't been able to shake the feeling of being watched, not since the painting had started changing. And that night, he stared at the portrait, really stared at it for the first time. The man's face seemed to loom larger, his eyes darker, more hollow, as if they were pulling him in. His expression was no longer just severe. It was something worse, something hungry. Then, as he watched, the man in the painting moved. Not much, just a subtle shift of his head, as though he had been holding his breath and had finally exhaled. But it was enough. The air in the hallway turned icy cold, and James felt a deep, nauseating dread settle in his stomach. It wasn't just a painting. It was a prison. The whispers grew louder that night. And in the morning, the portrait was different once more. Now, the man's mouth was slightly open, as though he were speaking, though no words came, but it was clear. He was trying to say something. The family spent the next few days researching the history of the house, but the more they uncovered, the worse it became. They discovered the portrait was of Charles Markham, a distant ancestor of James, who had been known for his cruelty and obsession with immortality. He had dabbled in dark, forbidden rituals, hoping to trap his soul in an object to live forever. And, as the family realized with growing horror, he had succeeded. The portrait was not just a painting. It was a prison, a trap for his soul, bound by his own dark magic. And now, the whispers, the footsteps, the lifelike changes in the portrait, they were all signs that Charles Markham's soul was beginning to claw its way out. He wanted freedom, and he wanted something in return. James was the last to understand. The figure in the portrait was no longer just watching. It was waiting, and it had no intention of letting them leave until it had what it wanted. In true Stephen King fashion, the story plays on the psychological unease of an old house with secrets, the slow unraveling of a family's safety, and the haunting terror of a malevolent force seeking escape. The portrait becomes more than just a piece of art. It is a symbol of a terrible history and a warning that some things are better left undisturbed. The room that moves. The house had been sitting abandoned for over 30 years, or so the locals said. Dust had settled over its hardwood floors. The windows had long since cracked, and the trees out front seemed to whisper in the wind, as if they knew something the people did not. The Carver family, a young couple with 2 children and too much time on their hands, saw it differently. They didn't see a dilapidated relic of a forgotten past. They saw potential. Ben, the father, was a history buff, always drawn to the stories behind the walls of old houses. Claire, his wife, was an artist, her eyes forever searching for inspiration in the mundane. It was their dream to restore the house, to bring it back to life, to make it their own. When the real estate agent handed them the keys with a nervous smile and a warning they ignored, the Carvers stepped inside with fresh hope. "I can't believe no one's bought this place yet," Claire said as she walked through the narrow hallway, her fingers brushing against the chipped wallpaper. "There's so much potential here." Ben grinned, scanning the living room. "We'll make it look brand new. I'll start with the plumbing and get the kitchen working again. After that, we can really dig in." The kids, twins named Sophie and Evan, were running ahead, chasing each other in there. Excitement, unaware of the weight of the house's silence. But that's how it always begins, doesn't it? A fresh coat of paint, a few repairs here and there, and the past is forgotten. It wasn't until their second day in the house that they found it. It was Sophie who discovered the hidden door. She was the more curious of the two children, always poking around corners and behind furniture where the grown-ups didn't bother to look. She'd found a bookcase in the living room that seemed to be oddly placed, a shelf of ancient leather-bound books stacked in disarray. She reached out to touch one, and when she did, the shelf creaked loudly, the wood scraping against the floor in an unsettling way. "Sophie, what are you doing?" Ben called out from the kitchen, but Sophie wasn't listening. She had found something. With one final push, the bookshelf moved, revealing a narrow doorway beyond. Claire, hearing the noise from the other room, rushed in, followed by Ben. There was no room, here on the blueprints, no space behind the walls where a door should be. "What is this?" Claire whispered, leaning in to peer inside. The room was small, barely large enough to fit a couch and a table, but the air inside was thick, as though it had been sealed off for decades. Dust and cobwebs clung to the corners, and the faint smell of something musty clung to the air. But what really struck them was the feeling, a sense of being watched, as if the walls themselves were alive. Ben stepped inside first, followed by Claire. The children hovered in the doorway, wide-eyed. "This is strange," Ben said, looking around at the plain furniture, an old armchair, a small writing desk, a rusted lamp that flickered to life when he touched it. And that's when things began to get strange. Over the next few days, the family made it a habit to investigate the room, but something wasn't right. Each time they left, they would return to find that things had moved. The armchair, which had been pushed up against the wall, would now sit in the center of the room. The books on the small table would be stacked differently, the lamp's position always changing. But the most unsettling part, the sense that someone or something was always there with them, watching, waiting. It wasn't just the rearrangement of furniture that began to bother them. It was the way the room seemed to shift. The space felt wrong, as if it didn't conform to the rules of the house. The walls seemed to change shape when no one was looking, stretching longer, or drawing in tighter. The door, which had once led out to the hallway, now opened into a different part of the house entirely. It was as though the room was moving. "Dad, it's doing it again," Evan whispered one night, his small hand clutching his father's arm. Ben and Claire exchanged uneasy glances. They had seen it, too. The room had been in the exact same spot earlier in the day, but now, when they returned from the kitchen, the door was in a different place, twisting in a way that shouldn't have been possible. "I'm getting a bad feeling about this," Claire said quietly, glancing around the room. "It's not right." Ben nodded. "Maybe we should block it off, seal it up, and forget it's here." But it was too late. The room had already begun to affect them. They couldn't keep their minds off it, no matter how hard they tried. Each time they walked past the door there, eyes would be drawn to it. They couldn't stay away. That night, when the house settled into its familiar creaks and groans, the whispers began. Soft, barely audible at first, but undeniable once you heard them. The whispers came from the room. They weren't words, just a low murmur like wind, shifting through the cracks of the walls. But they weren't comforting either. They were insistent, as if something were trying to tell them something that hadn't been spoken in a long, long time. Sophie, who had been the first to find the room, woke in the middle of the night, drawn to it like a moth to a flame. She crept quietly through the house, past her sleeping parents, and into the hallway, the whispers growing louder as she neared the door. She reached out for the doorknob, but before she could touch it, the door swung open on its own, revealing a vast, dark space, an abyss that seemed to stretch on forever. The room had grown. Her heart raced as the shadows shifted, the room itself seeming to pulse with life. And then, from the far corner, she saw it, a figure standing in the dark. It was barely visible, a shadow among shadows, but its eyes, those eyes were unmistakable. They glowed faintly in the darkness, and they were fixed on her. The figure didn't move. It didn't need to. Sophie felt it, a presence in her mind, pulling at her, urging her forward, closer to the door. Her fingers trembled as she stepped forward. The whispers had become voices, now, clear and demanding. Come closer, and we'll show you everything. Sophie took another step. The room shifted. By morning, the carvers had disappeared. The neighbors said they'd heard strange noises coming from the house, but when they called the authorities, no one could find any trace of the family. The door to the hidden room remained closed, its bookshelf pressed tightly against the wall once again. But if you listen closely enough, if you stand outside on a cold night and press your ear to the old house, you might hear it, the whispers, faint and distant but growing, stronger each night. The room is still there, somewhere, shifting and waiting, alive in ways that no one can understand, and it will always want more. The shadow in the mirror. When the Ashford family moved into the old mansion at the edge of town, they did so with dreams of escape, away from the crowded city, away from the pressures of life. The house was everything they had hoped for, spacious, isolated, and brimming with history. Nestled on a hill, the mansion stood tall, surrounded by the thickening woods. The walls, though crumbling in places, seemed to hold secrets that whispered in the cracks. It was late afternoon when the mirror was first discovered. The attic was a place the family had not yet ventured, filled with dusty furniture covered in old sheets and forgotten relics of a past life. Claire Ashford, the youngest of the family, found it, an ornate, gilded mirror, standing proudly against the far wall. It was strange, though, that no one else had noticed it before. It hadn't been there when the family moved in, or so they thought. It was framed in dark wood, intricately carved with patterns that seemed to swirl and shift when you looked at them too long. The first time Claire stood in front of the mirror, she had been alone in the attic. Her reflection seemed normal, but as she stared at herself, something moved behind her, a shadow. It was fleeting, nothing more than a passing sensation. When she turned around, nothing was there, just the old wooden beams and dusty boxes. She dismissed it, though a knot began to form in her stomach. The following days felt heavier, as though the house was settling deeper into its bones. Claire's parents, Thomas and Rachel, began to notice strange occurrences as well. Items would be out of place. Her mother's keys on the kitchen counter, then on the mantel. The lamps would flicker at night, casting long, ominous shadows. But it was the mirror that began to draw them in. It started with Claire again, her fingers brushing against the frame, the ornate carvings, almost too smooth. She had been spending more time in the attic, drawn to the mirrors. Dark allure. It wasn't long before the shadow began to take form. At first, it was nothing more than a vague shape, a figure standing behind Claire in the reflection, a silhouette without features, just an outline of darkness. But as the days passed, it grew clearer, more defined. The figure took on the shape of a man, tall and hunched, with hollow eyes and a mouth that never moved, but still seemed to grin. Claire couldn't tear herself away. Every time she looked into the mirror, the figure became more distinct, more tangible. It followed her, step by step, until she could no longer tell where her reflection ended and the figure began. The Ashfords grew concerned. Strange things were happening around the house. Rachel's dream became a recurring nightmare, where she found herself staring into the mirror, unable to look away as the figure reached through the glass toward her, its fingers stretching, scraping against the edges. In the dark of night, Thomas would wake to the sound of whispering voices, cold and sharp, calling his name. But when he reached the attic, the house was silent. One evening, Claire's reflection didn't move with her. She lifted her arm to wave, and the shadowed figure in the mirror raised its arm in sync. But then it didn't stop. It held its arm up longer, bending in a way that made Claire's stomach churn. The figure's mouth opened in a silent scream. Claire stumbled back, horrified, but the reflection held its posture, no longer mimicking her movements, but acting on its own accord. Rachel rushed to her daughter's side, but the shadow in the mirror was gone when she looked. Claire was trembling, eyes wide with fear. "It's in there," she whispered. "It wants to come out." Thomas, ever the skeptic, tried to dismiss it as a trick of light, but the unease had settled deep into his chest. The family could no longer ignore the truth. There was something alive in the mirror, something trapped. One night, Thomas decided to confront it, armed with nothing more than a flashlight and his waning courage. He made his way up to the attic. He stared into the mirror, waiting for the shadow to reappear. When it did, it was closer than ever before, its dark eyes now burning with an unnatural intensity. The figure's lips parted into a smile, but it wasn't friendly. The smile stretched too wide, exposing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. And then Thomas felt it, something cold, something wrong, pressing against his chest, as though the very air was thickening with the figure's presence. His own reflection wavered. He saw his face contort into an expression of horror that wasn't his own. The figure in the mirror began to move, slowly, deliberately. It reached out, its fingers stretching, extending, and for the first time, it crossed over the boundary of the glass. Thomas screamed, backing away, but it wasn't enough. The shadow lunged, reaching through the glass, its icy hand gripping his wrist. Rachel and Claire burst into the room just in time to see the last remnants of Thomas's form slip through the mirror, his body pulled into the reflection as though it was a dark pool of water. The mirror was silent once more. The days that followed were a blur of confusion and terror. Rachel, heartbroken and broken, attempted to understand what had happened, but there were no answers, no explanations, just a mirror that stood untouched in the attic. And then one night, Rachel found herself standing before it. She could hear Thomas's voice calling her name, pleading for help. She reached for the mirror, unable to stop herself, and as her hand touched the cold surface, the reflection changed. Thomas was there, but he wasn't her husband anymore. His eyes were hollow, his smile twisted, and behind him, the shadow stood, waiting. The entity trapped inside the mirror had finally found its way out. The unseen guest. The house stood on the outskirts of town, its towering silhouette casting long shadows. Across the overgrown yard, The kind of house you'd only see in an old photograph or in one of those stories your grandmother would whisper about late at night. It had been abandoned for nearly 2 decades, but when the Harris family, David, his wife Ellen, and their 2 children, Lucy and Sam, found the listing, it seemed too perfect. It was big, spacious, full of history, and most importantly, it was cheap. David, a freelance writer trying to get his career back on track, saw it as a fresh start, a quiet place to work, a house big enough for the kids to roam, a project to sink his teeth into. Ellen, though a bit more cautious, was charmed by its faded grandeur. She saw potential in the peeling wallpaper and the sagging floors. The kids, who'd spent too many years crammed into their tiny city apartment, were thrilled by the idea of space and open land, and so they moved in. The first few days were full of the usual hustle, unpacking boxes, exploring the houses, many rooms, dusting off old furniture, and getting used to the musty air that seemed to seep from the very walls. The house was a relic of a time long gone, but it had its charms. The grand staircase that led up to the second floor, the long hallways that seemed to stretch on forever, the library lined with books that had yellowed with age, and the room, that room. It was on the 3rd floor, hidden at the end of a narrow hallway that seemed almost too narrow, as if the house itself was trying to keep it secret. The door was locked when they first arrived, a rusty padlock that rattled as Ellen tried to turn it, but after some effort it opened with a sickening creak, the heavy with groaning under the pressure. Inside, the room was dark, though sunlight filtered weakly through the cracked windows. The air was thick, stale, like it had been trapped there for years. Nothing in the room seemed unusual at first glance. There were old, forgotten pieces of furniture, of vanity, a small desk, a moth-eaten rug. Dust hung in the air like smoke, thick and suffocating. The room felt heavy, as if something had been stored there and forgotten, something not quite right. Still, they chalked it up to the house's age, its history, the lingering echoes of the past. But it didn't take long for them to realize they weren't alone. The first sign was subtle. One night after dinner, Ellen was in the kitchen while David took the kids upstairs to get ready for bed. The house was quiet, as it often was, with only the soft creaks of the floorboards beneath their feet and the faint hum of the refrigerator in the background. Ellen was washing the dishes when she heard it, a soft shuffle, like footsteps on the wooden floors. She paused, soap still on her hands, her heart thudding in her chest. But when she turned, there was no one there. The next day, it happened again. This time, the sound came from the hall outside the kitchen, faint but unmistakable. A presence, something watching. Ellen stood still for a moment, her breath held, but again, there was nothing. It was only when David was working late one evening, his fingers tapping away at the keys of his laptop, that Lucy came rushing into his study. Her eyes were wide with fear, her face pale. "Mom's in the hallway," she said, voice trembling. "But there's no one there." David frowned, confused. "What do you mean? There's no one there?" She was standing right outside the study, but when I looked, she was gone. David shrugged it off at first. A child's imagination, he thought. Or maybe Lucy had seen something in the corner of her eye, a shadow passing by. But it happened again, and this time Sam was with her. They both claimed they saw someone walking past their bedroom door late at night, someone who wasn't there. Ellen had heard it too, the soft, shuffling footsteps echoing in the halls at night, the faint sound of a door creaking open when no one was nearby. And then came the photographs. It started with a simple family photo taken in the backyard one sunny afternoon. The Harris family stood together, smiling. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, but when Ellen had the film developed, something strange caught her eye. In the far corner of the picture, partially hidden behind a tree, there was a shadow, a shape that didn't belong. At first, she thought it was a trick of the light, a cloud passing in front of the sun. But when she looked at the other photos taken in different rooms at different times, she saw it again, that same shadow, always lurking in the background, always just out of reach. In some pictures, it was clearer, almost human-shaped, though its features were indistinct, like something smudged on the edge of reality. David, ever the skeptic, refused to believe it. "It's just a trick of the camera," he said. "Some kind of exposure issue, that's all." But the presence didn't stop there. It began to invade their tapes as well. They would sit down at night to watch the home videos they recorded since moving in. At first, it seemed harmless, just the sound of their voices, the rustle of their movements. But as the tapes progressed, a distortion began to creep in. The audio would fluctuate, the voices warping, becoming indistinct, like a radio station losing signal. And in the background, beneath the distorted noise, there was a faint whispering, a low, gravelly murmur that seemed to speak their names. David, Ellen, the children began to have nightmares. They would wake up screaming in the middle of the night, claiming that they'd heard footsteps outside their doors, soft and slow, the sound of someone or something just waiting. Ellen's anxiety grew, her nerves fraying, as she felt the presence growing stronger, more demanding. They couldn't leave. Every attempt to escape the house felt futile, as though the air itself was keeping them there, pulling them back. The walls seemed to close in on them, the floorboards creaking beneath their weight, and the whispers, they grew louder. It wasn't long before they realized it wasn't just watching them. It was planning something far darker. The truth came one night when David decided to confront the entity, to find out what it wanted. He walked to the door of that room, the one that had remained locked for so many years, and opened it, his heart racing in his chest. The room was unchanged. The air was thick with the smell of mildew, and the furniture lay as it had been. But in the center of the room, standing perfectly still, was a figure, a shadow that seemed to pulse with life. It was tall, its form shifting like smoke, but it was solid enough to be felt. David reached out to it, as if to push it away, but his hand passed to the figure as though it were made of air. The whispering started again, louder now. The voice was no longer a whisper. It was a growl. "You were never meant to stay," it said, its voice echoing in the room. "You should have never come." David stumbled backward, his body frozen in terror. The figure took a step toward him, its outline distorting, like it was trying to materialize in full. But the air around him grew, heavier, thicker, suffocating. Then, just as quickly as it appeared, the figure was gone, dissipating into the air like smoke. The house was silent once again, but the shadows lingered. The Harris family never left the mansion. They couldn't. Not truly. They stayed trapped in the house, bound by something far older than they could understand. The entity, the unseen guest, had plans for them, plans that stretched far beyond the physical realm. It had been waiting for them, watching them, preparing for the moment when they would enter its grasp. And now, they were part of the house, part of the whispers, part of the shadows, part of the curse that had been there long before they ever arrived. The whispers beneath the floorboards. Sam and Emma Forsythe had always dreamed of finding the perfect house. After years of living in cramped apartments, juggling jobs, and scraping by, they finally found it. The old Victorian house on Oak Street, abandoned for decades and covered in a tangle of vines. Its peeling paint and crumbling foundation only seemed to add to its charm. It was the kind of house you read about in books, The kind that had character, the kind that whispered stories if you knew how to listen. The house was cheap, too cheap. Sam liked that, though. It was exactly what they needed, a project. Emma, always the optimist, was thrilled at the idea of restoring it to its former glory. The house had a history. She could feel it in her bones. But there was something else, something deeper, something that tugged at her with every creak of the floorboards and every groan of the timbers. It didn't take long for the whispers to begin. They had been working on the house for weeks. They started with the basement, stripping away the old, rotten wood and cleaning up the debris left behind by years of neglect. Sam found an old floorboard near the far corner that had begun to sag, as if something beneath it was pushing up against it. At first, he thought it was just termites, or maybe a rat nest. But when he pried up the board, he found something else entirely, a series of yellow diaries, stacked in the darkness beneath. The air in the basement grew cold when he opened them, a sharp, unnatural chill that made Emma shiver despite the warmth of the house above. The diaries were from the early 1900s, written in a shaky, desperate hand. Each entry was filled with confusion, fear, and sorrow. The first one was dated 1912. The man who wrote it, John Hargrove, the house's first owner, described strange happenings within the house. Voices, he wrote, coming from beneath the floor, from the walls. I don't know if I'm losing my mind, but I swear they are there, calling me by name. Sam and Emma had exchanged uneasy glances, but Emma, ever the historian, wanted to read on. She turned the page, her fingers trembling as she revealed more. The next entries were darker, more frantic. Tonight, the whispers came louder. I can't sleep. It feels like they're watching me, waiting for me to slip. There are no other sounds. No birds, no wind. Just the voices. I'm afraid. The third diary was even worse. It was nearly illegible, the handwriting almost impossible to read, as though the author was in a state of utter panic. I hear them beneath the floorboards, under the house. There are bodies down there, bodies that never had a proper burial. Their souls are trapped and they won't leave. They want to drag me into the darkness with them. At that moment, the whispers started. They were soft at first, so faint Sam thought it might just be the wind or the house settling. But as he listened closer, he realized they were words. Words that seemed to come from below, from the very bowels of the house. They were saying his name, Sam. He turned to Emma, his eyes wide with fear. She could hear it too, the low, drawn-out sound of something whispering from beneath the house. It wasn't the wind. It was something else, something alive. They hurried upstairs, but the whispers followed them, echoing through the floorboards. That night, sleep was impossible. Every time Sam closed his eyes, he heard the soft murmur of the voices, growing louder and more insistent, like the scratch of fingernails against the walls. The next day, Emma was determined to dig deeper. She couldn't let it go. The house had a story to tell, and she was going to uncover it. As she continued reading through the diaries, she learned of the house's dark past. John Hargrove had not been the only one to hear the whispers. His family had heard them too, his wife, his children, and they all went mad. The whispers grew sharper as the days passed. Sam could no longer sleep, no longer think. He could feel the presence beneath him, pressing up through the floors, the walls, the very foundation of the house. It wasn't just the whispers anymore. It was a sense of something pulling at his mind, clawing its way into his thoughts, whispering promises of release and escape. The final diary entry, written in a hand that was trembling with terror, revealed the horrifying truth. I've seen them, the spirits. They are here, in the walls. They don't want me to leave. I can feel them pushing me. They want me to stay, to join them. They are trapped, just like me, and I will be one of them soon. That night, Sam and Emma decided to leave. They packed their things, but as they moved toward the front door, the house itself seemed to reject them. The floorboards began to creak and groan as if something was moving beneath them. The whispers filled the air louder than ever. They were no longer just voices, they were screams. And then, as they stood by the door, frozen in terror, the floor beneath them began to crack, slowly at first, then with terrifying force. The voices from below surged upward, filling the room, pushing against the walls, the windows, the door. It was as if the house itself was alive, trying to swallow them whole. With a final, deafening crash, the floorboards gave way, and something reached up from the darkness, grabbing Sam's legs, pulling him into the void below. "Sam!" Emma screamed, but her voice was swallowed by the howling wind, the shrieking, whispers that were now deafening. She reached for him, but he was gone, pulled beneath the house, into the suffocating darkness. The whispers didn't stop, and the house once again fell silent. Emma was the last one left. She ran. She didn't stop running until she reached the edge of town, breathless, her heart pounding, her mind reeling. The house still stands on Oak Street waiting. The whispers still echo beneath the floorboards, calling to anyone who dares to listen. The souls of those trapped beneath the house, trapped in the walls, the floors, the very foundations, will never leave. They will never find peace. And they want one thing: to pull anyone who comes too close into the dark, to join them in their endless torment. And one day, they will find someone willing to listen. The Ghost Valley. The sun dipped below the jagged peaks of the valley, casting long shadows over the village of Hallows End. The air was thick with the scent of pine and the dampness of the nearby river, but something else lingered, a chilling unease that gripped the heart like icy claws. Few dared to speak of it openly, but everyone knew Ghost Valley was cursed. A soft knock at the wooden door of the village's only tavern startled Amelia, the innkeeper's daughter. She had heard tales of travelers who never returned from the valley. Their voices whispered in the cold wind that snaked through the village at night. But tonight, the knock came from someone very much alive. "Come in," Amelia called, trying to mask her nervousness. The door creaked open to reveal a tall, cloaked figure. His face was partially hidden beneath the brim of a wide hat, and his boots were caked with the mud of a long journey. "Ale and a place to rest," he said, his voice low and gravelly. Amelia poured the man's drink, her hands trembling slightly. "Passing through?" she asked, trying to sound casual. The man looked at her, his piercing blue eyes catching the flicker of the firelight. "I'm here for the valley," he said simply. The room fell silent. Even the old men who had been muttering over their cards froze. One of them, a wiry man named Fergus, finally spoke. "You'd best think twice about that. Ghost Valley ain't a place for the living." The traveler shrugged. "I've heard the stories. That's why I'm here." Amelia's curiosity got the better of her. "Why, what do you hope to find there?" The man's lips curved into a faint smile. "Answers." The following morning, the village was blanketed in a dense fog that seemed to cling to every surface. The traveler, who introduced himself as Alden, prepared to leave despite the warnings he'd received the night before. "If you're dead set on going, at least take this," Fergus said, thrusting a worn leather satchel into Alden's hands. "It's got some herbs, a flask of holy water, and, well, some charms my grandmother swore by. Might not do much, but it's better than nothing." Alden nodded his thanks and set off toward the valley. As he approached the entrance, the fog grew thicker, muffling his footsteps and muting the sounds of the forest. The trees here were ancient, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal hands. A sense of dread settled over him, but he pressed on. The first sign that he was not alone came in the form of a faint whisper. It was so soft that he thought he'd imagined it, but then it came again, clearer this time. Turn back. Alden froze, his hand instinctively reaching for the dagger at his belt. "Who's there?" he called, his voice steady despite the knot of fear tightening in his chest. The whispering stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. Alden's grip on his dagger tightened as he continued forward. The path twisted and turned, leading him deeper into the valley. The air grew colder, and the fog seemed to pulse with a life of its own, swirling around him like a shroud. It was then that he saw it. A figure standing in the distance, barely visible through the mist. It was unnaturally still, its outline blurred as if it were part of the fog itself. "Who are you?" Alden demanded, his voice echoing unnaturally in the stillness. The figure did not move or respond. Summoning his courage, Alden stepped closer. As he did, the figure vanished, leaving behind only the faintest trace of a shadow on the ground. A shiver ran down his spine, but he refused to turn back. Whatever answers lay hidden in Ghost Valley, he was determined to uncover them. Hours passed, or perhaps only minutes. Time seemed to lose all meaning in the valley. The path led Alden to a clearing where the remains of an old chapel stood. The structure was crumbling, its wooden beams warped and blackened as if by fire. A rusted iron bell hung precariously from a broken tower, swaying gently in a breeze that Alden couldn't feel. Inside the chapel, the air was heavy with the scent of decay. Broken pews were scattered across the floor, and the altar was covered in strange symbols carved into the wood. Alden approached cautiously, his eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. As he reached the altar, he noticed a book lying open on its surface. The pages were yellowed and brittle, covered in an unfamiliar script that seemed to shift and writhe as he tried to read it. The words were incomprehensible, but the illustrations were hauntingly clear. Twisted, nightmarish creatures and scenes of torment that made his stomach churn. A sudden gust of wind blew through the chapel, extinguishing his lantern and plunging the room into darkness. Alden's pulse quickened as he fumbled for a match. When he finally relit the lantern, he saw that he was no longer alone. A woman stood at the far end of the chapel, her pale skin glowing faintly in the dim light. Her eyes were empty sockets, and her mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. "Why have you come?" she whispered, her voice echoing unnaturally. Alden took a step back, his hand on his dagger. "I seek the truth about this place." The woman's smile widened, revealing rows of jagged teeth. "The truth," she hissed. "The truth is not for the living." Before Alden could respond, the ground beneath him began to tremble. Shadows rose from the corners of the chapel, coalescing into forms that defied explanation. The air was filled with a cacophony of screams and whispers, each more horrifying than the last. Summoning all his courage, Alden turned and ran, the shadows clawing at his heels. He burst out of the chapel and into the foggy night, his breath coming in ragged gasps. But the valley was not done with him yet. The fog seemed thicker now, almost alive, as if the valley itself was determined to hold Alden in its grasp. His breath came in ragged bursts. Each step forward met with the unnerving sensation that the shadows were right behind him, clawing at his back. He stopped in the middle of the path, his chest heaving. The silence that followed was oppressive, broken only by the faint rustle of unseen movement. Alden's hand instinctively tightened around the leather satchel Fergus had given him. The charms inside seemed to hum faintly, a strange warmth emanating through the worn leather. "What do you want from me?" he shouted into the void. The only answer was laughter, soft at first, then building into a chorus of distorted, mocking voices. The sound was disorienting, as if it came from every direction at once. Alden spun around, his dagger raised, but there was nothing there. Only the fog, dense and impenetrable. The forest of Wales. The path soon led him to a grove of trees that seemed more dead than alive. Their gnarled branches twisted toward the sky like pleading hands, and the bark was marred with deep, unnatural scars. As Alden moved deeper into the grove, he began to hear the cries. They were faint at first, but soon they grew louder, filling the air with an agonizing symphony of sorrow and despair. Alden stopped in his tracks, his blood running cold. The cries seemed to emanate from the trees themselves, as if the souls of the damned were trapped within the twisted wood. One tree in particular drew his attention. It was larger than the others, its trunk split down the middle like a gaping wound. "Help us!" The voice was faint but unmistakable. Alden hesitated, then cautiously approached the tree. As he did, the split in the trunk seemed to widen, revealing a faint, flickering light deep within. It was mesmerizing, pulling him closer despite the dread that gripped his heart. "Don't touch it!" The voice of a child whispered from somewhere behind him. Alden spun around, but there was no one there. The grove was empty, save for the trees and their mournful wails. When he turned back to the split tree, the light was gone, replaced by an inky darkness that seemed to reach out toward him. He stumbled back, clutching the satchel. The flask of holy water inside seemed to pulse with warmth, a comforting reminder that he wasn't entirely defenseless. Clutching it tightly, he whispered a prayer under his breath, one he hadn't uttered in years, and pressed forward. The keeper of the valley. As Alden emerged from the grove, he found himself at the edge of a massive chasm. The fog dissipated slightly here, revealing a rickety wooden bridge that spanned the abyss. The boards were cracked and splintered, swaying ominously in the breeze. On the other side of the chasm stood a figure cloaked in shadow. It was tall and gaunt, its face obscured by a hood that seemed to blend into the darkness around it. In its hand, it held a staff carved from the same twisted wood as the trees in the grove. "You seek answers," the figure said, its voice deep and resonant, carrying easily across the chasm. "But do you understand the cost?" Alden stepped onto the bridge, his boots creaking against the fragile boards. "I'll pay whatever it takes." The figure chuckled, a hollow, humorless sound. "Brave words. Many have spoken them before you, and now their voices echo in the wails of the damned." Alden tightened his grip on his dagger. "Who are you?" "I am the keeper," the figure replied. "This valley is my charge, and its secrets are mine to guard." "Then tell me," Alden demanded, "what happened here? Why is this place cursed?" The keeper tilted its head, as if considering the question. "This valley was once a sanctuary, a place of peace and refuge. But greed and betrayal turned it into a prison for restless souls. Now, it is neither of the living nor the dead." Before Alden could respond, the keeper raised its staff. The ground beneath the bridge began to shake, and the chasm below erupted with a deafening roar. Ghostly figures rose from the depths, their faces twisted in anguish. They clawed at the air, their hollow eyes fixed on Alden. "Turn back now," the keeper warned, "or join them." The descent. Alden's resolve wavered for the first time, but he forced himself to stand firm. "I didn't come this far to turn back." The keeper sighed, almost as if in pity, and lowered its staff. The ghostly figures receded, and the shaking stopped. "Then you must face the heart of the valley." The bridge creaked dangerously as Alden crossed, each step a test of his nerve. When he reached the other side, the keeper was gone, replaced by a narrow path that led downward into darkness. The air grew colder with every step, and the faint glow of the surface disappeared behind him. The descent seemed endless, but eventually Alden reached the bottom, a vast cavern illuminated by an eerie, greenish light. At the center of the cavern was a pool of water, its surface unnaturally still. Surrounding the pool were figures cloaked in shadow, their heads bowed as if in prayer. Alden approached cautiously, his footsteps echoing in the silence. As he drew closer, one of the figures raised its head. Its face was featureless, a blank slate of pale flesh. It spoke without moving its lips. "Why have you come?" "I seek the truth," Alden replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "The truth is a burden," the figure said. "Once you bear it, you cannot lay it down." "I'm ready," Alden said, though his trembling hands betrayed his fear. The figure stepped aside, revealing the pool. Its surface rippled as if in response to his presence, and the light within it grew brighter. Alden knelt beside the water and looked into its depths. What he saw stole the breath from his lungs. The visions were a cascade of horrors, faces twisted in agony, rivers of blood, the screams of countless souls. But beneath the terror was something else, a flicker of understanding, a glimpse of the truth he had sought. When the visions faded, Alden collapsed to the ground, his body trembling. The figures around the pool began to chant, their voices rising in a haunting melody. "The valley has chosen," they intoned. "You are its keeper now." Alden's eyes widened in horror as the realization dawned. The truth he had sought was his curse to bear. The valley would never let him leave. Weeks later, a group of travelers arrived at Hallow's End. They spoke of a figure standing at the edge of the valley, cloaked in shadow and holding a staff of twisted wood. When they asked the villagers about him, they received only one response. Ghost Valley has a new keeper, the haunting of Blackwood Manor. The road to Blackwood Manor twisted and turned like a serpent through the dense woods, each bend shrouded in mist. The trees stood tall, their branches twisted and gnarled, stretching toward the sky like skeletal arms. It was a stretch of road few dared to travel, and even fewer had any desire to. The whispers that surrounded Blackwood Manor were as thick as the fog that cloaked it. Tales of strange happenings, eerie sounds, and strange disappearances that stretched back decades. But Emma didn't care about the rumors. She had inherited the manor from her late uncle, and it was hers now. The inheritance letter had arrived unexpectedly. Emma had never been close to her uncle, an eccentric recluse who kept to himself, living alone in that old, decaying mansion far out of the city. The letter was short, almost curt in its formality, but it was clear. Her uncle, the last of the Blackwood line, had passed away, and the manor, along with its history, was now her responsibility. She had always been curious about her family, though she had never met her uncle. There were few stories about him, and even fewer about the manor. Most people who had lived in the small town nearby had long avoided the house. Some spoke of it in hushed tones. Others dismissed it as a relic of a forgotten time. But something about the place pulled at Emma's imagination. A sense of unease had settled in her chest as she prepared for her journey to the manor. She wasn't sure why. Perhaps it was the looming presence of the mansion on the horizon, or the strange letter she had received. But she packed her things anyway, determined to see for herself. After all, this was her inheritance. When Emma arrived at the gates of Blackwood Manor, she was taken aback by its imposing silhouette against the sky. The mansion loomed, its windows like dark eyes staring down at her, its stone walls covered in ivy, almost as if nature had tried to reclaim the land. The gate was rusted and broken in places, the metal twisted and worn by time, yet it still stood defiantly at the entrance, as if guarding the secrets within. With a deep breath, Emma pushed the gate open, the rusty hinges protesting with a screech that echoed through the still air. The gravel path leading to the house was overgrown with weeds and wildflowers, and the once grand front steps were chipped and cracked. As she walked up to the door, the mansion seemed to watch her, its cold, unblinking windows like eyes that followed her every movement. The door creaked open at her touch, as though it had been waiting for someone to enter. A stale, musty smell hit her immediately. It was as though the house hadn't seen the light of day in years. Inside, the grand foyer was dark and silent, the only sound the echo of her footsteps on the creaking floorboards. The air was thick with dust, the light filtering in through the tall windows above, casting long shadows on the walls. The place had an eerie charm, though. Despite the decay, there was a certain beauty to it. The walls were adorned with large portraits, their colors faded with age, the faces of long-dead relatives staring down at her with unsettling, lifeless eyes. She felt a strange unease as she gazed at them, as though they were watching her. judging her presence in the house. As Emma walked further into the house, she noticed the signs of abandonment. The furniture was covered in white sheets. Layers of dust settled on every surface. The grand chandelier above her was thick with cobwebs, its crystals dulled and coated with grime. It was a house frozen in time, as though its occupants had vanished overnight and never returned. Emma's curiosity got the better of her, and she began to explore the rooms. The house seemed to stretch endlessly, each corridor leading to more rooms filled with forgotten relics. The kitchen was overrun with rats and old food, the walls of the dining room covered in peeling wallpaper. It was as though the house had been stuck in a perpetual state of decline, each room a tomb of the past. In the sitting room, she found a large, ornate mirror leaning against the wall. It was covered in a thick layer of dust, but as Emma wiped it away, she was struck by the intricacy of its design. The frame was carved with delicate patterns, intricate swirls, strange symbols, and haunting faces that seemed to move as the light shifted. It was beautiful, yet there was something unsettling about it, a sense of ancient power embedded in its very being. As Emma stood in front of the mirror, she thought she saw a faint movement behind her, a shadow flickering at the edge of her vision. She whipped around, but there was nothing there. Her heart began to race. It was nothing, just her imagination. But as she turned back to the mirror, her blood ran cold. The reflection in the mirror wasn't hers. There, standing behind her, was a tall, gaunt figure, its face hollow and pale, its eyes dark and empty. It was a man dressed in old-fashioned clothes, his features twisted in an expression of despair. Emma's breath caught in her throat. She stepped back, but the figure didn't move. It stood there, frozen, staring at her. Her heart thudded in her chest. She reached out a trembling hand to touch the mirror, and in that instant, the figure vanished, leaving only her own reflection staring back at her. Emma's mind raced. What had she seen? Was it a trick of the light? A shadow that had been cast in the wrong way? But she couldn't shake the feeling that the house was more than just a crumbling relic of the past. There was something alive within it, something watching her, waiting. That night, she tried to rest in the master bedroom, but the house would not let her. The air was thick with an unnatural chill, the sheets cold against her skin. She couldn't sleep, not with the thoughts racing through her mind, not with the strange whispers that seemed to drift through the walls. She listened closely, straining to hear. There was again the whispers, soft at first, like the rustling of dry leaves, then louder, more distinct. A murmur, a voice, no, multiple voices, whispering in the distance. The words were unintelligible, but they were growing louder, closer. They seemed to come from everywhere, surrounding her, filling the room with an oppressive weight. She bolted upright in bed, her heart pounding in her chest. The room was dark, the only light coming from the moon outside, casting long, eerie shadows across the floor. The whispers were still there, but she couldn't make out the words. She pulled the covers up to her chin, her breath quick and shallow. Then, as suddenly as they began, the whispers stopped. The silence was deafening. Emma lay back in the bed, wide awake, her body frozen with fear. She tried to tell herself it was nothing, that it was just the house settling, the wind outside making strange noises. But deep down, she knew something wasn't right. She had felt it the moment she stepped into the manor. The house was alive in a way she couldn't explain. It was more than just a building. It had a presence, an energy that seemed to seep into her very soul. The next morning, Emma decided to explore the house further, hoping to shake the unease that had settled over her. She opened doors to rooms she hadn't yet seen, each one revealing another layer of the manor's dark history. The library was filled with old, dusty books, some of them so ancient they seemed ready to crumble at her touch. The walls were lined with strange symbols and markings, like the ones she had seen in the mirror. She was drawn to a particular book, a large leather-bound volume, its pages yellowed and brittle with age. She opened it carefully, her fingers trembling as she turned the pages. The The words inside were written in an ancient language, one she didn't recognize, but there were pictures, two disturbing, grotesque drawings of faces, symbols, and creatures that seemed to twist and writhe on the page. One symbol in particular caught her eye. It was the same one she had seen carved into the mirror's frame, a twisted pattern of vines and skulls. Its meaning unclear, but its presence unmistakable. Suddenly, Emma heard a sound, a soft shuffle, like footsteps approaching. She spun around, but the room was empty. The door was closed, the windows shut tight. Yet the feeling of being watched lingered, thick and heavy in the air. The whispers started again. This version expands on Emma's exploration of Blackwood Manor, building the eerie atmosphere and tension. It delves deeper into her emotions and the growing sense of unease as she uncovers the secrets hidden within the mansion. Let me know if you need any adjustments or further additions. The air around Blackwood Manor felt different that morning. It was still heavy, almost suffocating, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Emma had barely slept the night before, the eerie whispers still echoing in her mind. She could hardly shake the feeling that someone, was watching her, waiting for the right moment to strike. When she awoke, the house was quieter than ever, yet the silence was more unnerving than comforting. The walls seemed to close in around her, and even the faint sound of birds chirping outside seemed distant and muffled, like it was coming from another world. Emma had no idea what she was dealing with, but she knew she had to find answers. She had already explored much of the manor, but there were still parts of the house she hadn't dared to enter. The library, the basement, and most ominously the attic were all areas she had avoided for the simple reason that they felt wrong. But today, she had resolved to uncover the truth. No more running, no more hiding from whatever had been lurking in the shadows. After a quick breakfast of stale bread and water, Emma ventured back into the hallway, determined to continue her exploration. The first room she entered was the library. It was a grand space, lined from floor to ceiling with towering bookshelves. Books of all shapes and sizes filled the shelves, some of them so ancient they appeared to be falling apart at the seams. The air was thick with the smell of old paper and dust. Emma moved cautiously, her fingers trailing along the spines of the books, her eyes scanning the titles. They were mostly volumes of history, some filled with intricate drawings and diagrams of strange symbols she couldn't understand. The more she looked, the more she felt like she was being drawn into something ancient and powerful, something that had been hidden away for centuries. At the back of the library, she found a large, ornate desk, its surface cluttered with papers and objects that seemed to have been hastily abandoned. There was a large ledger open on the desk, its pages filled with notes in a language she didn't recognize. But there, at the bottom of the page, was something that caught her eye, a symbol. It was the same twisted design she had seen etched into the mirror frame the day before, a pattern of interlocking vines, intertwined with skulls, all surrounding an ancient-looking sigil. Emma's heart raced as she stared at it. She knew, somehow, that it held the key to understanding what was happening in the manor. Turning the page, she was confronted with a chilling passage. The pact has been made, the soul is bound. We have given the gift of eternity, but at what cost? The curse that binds us will never break. We are bound to the house, as it is bound to us. The price of immortality is fear, and the one who comes will be the final sacrifice. Emma's breath caught in her throat. The words seemed to echo in her mind, reverberating off the walls of the library. The curse was real. It wasn't just a myth or a story. Her uncle had tried to break it, but the price of immortality was far too great. And now, she was here, in this very house, standing on the edge of something dark and ancient. Suddenly, a sound broke the stillness, a soft, almost imperceptible creak. Emma spun around, her heart pounding in her chest. The door to the library was ajar, and through the crack, she saw a figure standing in the hallway. It was the same figure she had seen in the mirror the day before. The tall, gaunt man with hollow eyes and a twisted expression. Her body froze in terror. She knew it wasn't her imagination. This figure was real. The man stepped forward, his form flickering in and out of focus, like a fading shadow. As he moved closer, Emma's breath became shallow, her pulse racing. His gaze was fixed on her, cold and relentless. And then, in a voice that seemed to come from all around her, the figure spoke. "You shouldn't have come, Emma." Her blood ran cold. How did he know her name? She tried to move, but her body refused to obey. Fear held her in place, as if the house itself had a grip on her. The figure took another step, and Emma could feel an icy chill creep up her spine. His eyes were dark, endless voids, and his lips twisted into a cruel, mocking smile. "You are too late," he said softly. "The curse cannot be undone. You cannot escape." With that, the figure vanished, melting into the shadows like a wisp of smoke. Emma blinked, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. The room was empty, the door still ajar, but the presence of the figure remained in the air. She could still feel his eyes on her, could still hear the echo of his voice. The terror gripped her harder now, but Emma knew she couldn't stop. She couldn't leave until she understood what had happened here, until she found a way to stop it. Taking a deep breath, Emma moved quickly through the library and out into the hall. She couldn't stay here much longer. The oppressive atmosphere of the manor was starting to crush her. There had to be more to this curse, more to the history of Blackwood Manor, and she was determined to uncover it. Her next stop was the basement. She had been avoiding it, but the more she thought about it, the more it seemed like the right place to find the answers. The basement was where the darkest secrets of the house were hidden, and Emma had a sinking feeling that the truth she sought lay beneath her feet. The basement door was located at the far end of the hallway, behind a heavy curtain of cobwebs. As she approached it, she felt an unexplainable weight settle over her chest. The house seemed to grow colder with every step she took. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the door handle, but she didn't hesitate. She couldn't afford to. The door creaked open with a sound that sent a jolt of fear through her. The stairs leading down into the darkness seemed to stretch endlessly, disappearing into the void below. Emma flicked on her flashlight and began her descent, each step echoing through the silence like a death knell. The basement was colder than the rest of the house, the air thick with the smell of mold and decay. As she stepped further into the darkness, her flashlight flickered, casting long, wavering shadows on the walls. The space was vast, with low ceilings and narrow passages. Old furniture, broken mirrors, and other discarded objects lay scattered about, as though the basement had once been used as a dumping ground for forgotten things. At the far end of the room, Emma spotted something that made her blood run cold. A large wooden chest sat against the wall, its surface scratched and worn. There was something strange about it, something almost alive. Her instincts screamed at her to leave, but she couldn't. She had to know. She walked over to the chest and knelt in front of it, her breath coming in shallow gasps. There was a metal latch, old and rusted, and as she lifted it, the chest creaked open. Inside, there was a tattered journal, its pages yellowed and brittle with age. The journal was her uncle's. Emma's hand shook as she opened it. The leather cover cracked with age. The first few pages were filled with hastily written notes, cryptic symbols, and scribbled references to the manor's dark history. The entries were chaotic, a mixture of fear and frustration. "I have tried everything. The curse is too powerful. The spirits will not rest. It is bound to the house, and the house is bound to me. The pact must be broken, but at what cost? I am not sure how much longer I can fight it." The more she read, the more she understood the depths of her uncle's torment. He had been consumed by the very thing he had tried to break. The house had taken hold of him, just as it was beginning to take hold of her. And then in the final pages of the journal, she found the horrifying truth. The price of breaking the curse is a soul. It will take what it desires, and the one who tries to break it will pay the ultimate price. I fear I will be its final victim. Suddenly, the temperature in the basement plummeted, and Emma felt a cold, malevolent presence closing in on her. The whispers returned, louder this time, growing more frantic, more desperate. The shadows in the corners of the basement seemed to stretch and writhe, and the walls themselves seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. Emma knew then that she was not alone. The spirits of the manor had found her. She slammed the journal shut and ran toward the stairs. But before she could reach the door, she heard a voice behind her. "You cannot escape, Emma. The curse has already claimed you." She turned around, her flashlight illuminating the figure of her uncle, standing in the doorway, his eyes hollow and his face twisted in pain. He was no longer the man she had known, but a shell of something far darker. The basement door slammed shut, trapping her inside. The shadow in the closet. The Petersons moved into the house on Maple Lane in early spring, the kind of house that seemed to smile at you with its wide front porch and cheerful yellow paint. It was big, enough for their growing family, with 3 bedrooms upstairs and a backyard where their 7-year-old son, Danny, could play. The house had its quirks, creaky floorboards, a drafty attic, and a closet in Danny's room that didn't quite close all the way. "It's just a settling of the house," David Peterson told his wife Karen the first night. They heard the faint knocks and groans from the walls. She nodded, though she didn't look convinced. The first time Danny mentioned the shadow in the closet, it was past midnight. Karen had tucked him in hours earlier, but she woke to find him standing at her bedside clutching his stuffed rabbit, Mr. Flop. "Mom," he whispered, his eyes wide and brimming with tears. "There's someone in my closet." Karen's heart sank. She followed him back to his room, turning on the lights and opening the closet door to show him it was empty. "See," she said, smiling, "just clothes and shoes. Nothing to be afraid of." Danny didn't look convinced. "He stands in the corner," Danny said, "where it's really dark." Karen gave him a reassuring hug and told him it was just a bad dream. But that night, she lay awake, staring at the shadows that stretched across her own bedroom ceiling. The shadows became a nightly occurrence. "He's back," Danny would say, standing in their doorway with Mr. Flop. Karen or David would dutifully check the closet, shining their phone's flashlight into the farthest corners. But there was never anything there, just a faint smell of old wood and the soft rustle of clothes swaying on their hangers. Still, Danny refused to sleep in his room, and after a week of sleepless nights they decided to let him sleep on a makeshift bed in their room. That was when the reflection started. It was Karen who noticed it first. She was brushing her teeth in the upstairs bathroom, half listening to the faint hum of the radio in the bedroom. She leaned forward to rinse, and for just a moment, she thought she saw something move in the mirror, a shadow, quick and fluid, sliding across the bathroom doorway. "David?" she called, her voice trembling. He appeared in the doorway, his expression puzzled. "Yeah." Karen shook her head, forcing a laugh. "Nothing. Just thought I saw something." David frowned but didn't press her. But the shadows grew bolder. The next evening, as the family ate dinner, Karen caught movement in the reflection of the microwave's glass door. She turned quickly, but there was nothing behind her, just the empty kitchen. Later that night, David saw the same thing in the television screen, a dark humanoid, shape shifting just out of view. "It's probably just our imagination," he said to Karen, though his voice lacked conviction. By the end of the week, every reflective surface in the house seemed to hold a trace of the shadow, the mirrors, the windows, even the glossy surface of the dining table. It was always just a flicker, gone as soon as they turned to look. And always, Danny insisted, the shadow returned to his closet. The breaking point came one rainy night in April. The power had gone out and the family, huddled together in the living room, candles casting long, flickering shadows across the walls. Danny was curled up in Karen's lap, his face buried in her shoulder. "He's here," Danny whispered. Karen stiffened. "What do you mean?" "The shadow. He's standing by the stairs." David shined the flashlight toward the staircase, his hands trembling. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but the banister. "There's nothing there, buddy," David said, though his voice cracked on the words. Danny lifted his head, his eyes wide and terrified. "He's coming closer." The next moment unfolded in a blur. The candles flickered violently, their flames, stretching unnaturally tall before snuffing out one by one. The air grew cold, and the room was plunged into darkness. Karen screamed as something brushed against her arm, cold and clammy, like a hand. David scrambled to relight a candle, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. When the flame finally caught, the shadow was gone. But the house felt different, empty. The Petersons moved out the next day, leaving behind most of their belongings, including the large mirror in the upstairs hallway that had always seemed to catch their reflection wrong. Months later, the new owners of the house found Danny's closet door standing wide, open, though they were certain they'd left it closed. And in the mirror by the staircase, they swore they saw a shadow watching them. It smiled, the Ghost Valley. The sun dipped below the jagged peaks of the valley, casting long shadows over the village of Hallows End. The air was thick with the scent of pine and the dampness of the nearby river, but something else lingered, a chilling unease that gripped the heart like icy claws. Few dared to speak of it openly, but everyone knew Ghost Valley was cursed. A soft knock at the wooden door of the village's only tavern startled Amelia, the innkeeper's daughter. She had heard tales of travelers who never returned from the valley. Their voices whispered in the cold wind that snaked through the village at night. But tonight, the knock came from someone very much alive. "Come in," Amelia called, trying to mask her nervousness. The door creaked open to reveal a tall, cloaked figure. His face was partially hidden beneath the brim of a wide hat, and his boots were caked with the mud of a long journey. "Ale and a place to rest," he said, his voice low and gravelly. Amelia poured the man's drink, her hands trembling slightly. "Passing through?" she asked, trying to sound casual. The man looked at her, his piercing blue eyes catching the flicker of the firelight. "I'm here for the valley," he said simply. The room fell silent. Even the old men who had been muttering over their cards froze. One of them, a wiry man named Fergus, finally spoke. "You'd best think twice about that. Ghost Valley ain't a place for the living." The traveler shrugged. "I've heard the stories. That's why I'm here." Amelia's curiosity got the better of her. "Why? What do you hope to find there?" The man's lips curved into a faint smile. "Answers." The following morning, the village was blanketed in a dense fog that seemed to cling to every surface. The traveler, who introduced himself as Alden, prepared to leave despite the warnings he'd received the night before. "If you're dead set on going, at least take this," Fergus said, thrusting a worn leather satchel into Alden's hands. "It's got some herbs, a flask of holy water, and, well, some charms my grandmother swore by. Might not do much, but it's better than nothing." Alden nodded his thanks and set off toward the valley. As he approached the entrance, the fog grew thicker, muffling his footsteps and muting the sounds of the forest. The trees here were ancient, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal hands. A sense of dread settled over him, but he pressed on. The first sign that he was not alone came in the form of a faint whisper. It was so soft that he thought he'd imagined it, but then it came again, clearer this time. "Turn back." Alden froze, his hand instinctively reaching for the dagger at his belt. "Who's there?" he called, his voice steady despite the knot of fear tightening in his chest. The whispering stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. Alden's grip on his dagger tightened as he continued forward. The path twisted and turned, leading him deeper into the valley. The air grew colder, and the fog seemed to pulse with a life of its own, swirling around him like a shroud. It was then that he saw it, a figure standing in the distance, barely visible through the mist. It was unnaturally still, its outline blurred as if it were part of the fog itself. "Who are you?" Alden demanded, his voice echoing unnaturally in the stillness. The figure did not move or respond. Summoning his courage, Alden stepped closer. As he did, the figure vanished, leaving behind only the faintest trace of a shadow on the ground. A shiver ran down his spine, but he refused to turn back. Whatever answers lay hidden in Ghost Valley, he was determined to uncover them. Hours passed, or perhaps only minutes. Time seemed to lose all meaning in the valley. The path led Alden to a clearing where the remains of an old chapel stood. The structure was crumbling, its wooden beams warped and blackened as if by fire. A rusted iron bell hung precariously from a broken tower, swaying gently in a breeze that Alden couldn't feel. Inside the chapel, the air was heavy with the scent of decay. Broken pews were scattered across the floor, and the altar was covered in strange symbols carved into the wood. Alden approached cautiously, his eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. As he reached the altar, he noticed a book lying open on its surface. The pages were yellowed and brittle, covered in an unfamiliar script that seemed to shift and writhe as he tried to read it. The words were incomprehensible, but the illustrations were hauntingly clear. Twisted, nightmarish creatures and scenes of torment that made his stomach churn. A sudden gust of wind blew through the chapel, extinguishing his lantern and plunging the room into darkness. Alden's pulse quickened as he fumbled for a match. When he finally relit the lantern, he saw that he was no longer alone. A woman stood at the far end of the chapel, her pale skin glowing faintly in the dim light. Her eyes were empty sockets, and her mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. "Why have you come?" she whispered, her voice echoing unnaturally. Alden took a step back, his hand on his dagger. "I seek the truth about this place." The woman's smile widened, revealing rows of jagged teeth. "The truth," she hissed. "The truth is not for the living." Before Alden could respond, the ground beneath him began to tremble. Shadows rose from the corners of the chapel, coalescing into forms that defied explanation. The air was filled with a cacophony of screams and whispers, each more horrifying than the last. Summoning all his courage, Alden turned and ran, the shadows clawing at his heels. He burst out of the chapel and into the foggy night, his breath coming in ragged gasps. But the valley was not done with him yet. The fog seemed thicker now, almost alive, as if the valley itself was determined to hold Alden in its grasp. His breath came in ragged bursts. Each step forward met with the unnerving sensation that the shadows were right behind him, clawing at his back. He stopped in the middle of the path, his chest heaving. The silence that followed was oppressive, broken only by the faint rustle of unseen movement. Alden's hand instinctively tightened around the leather satchel Fergus had given him. The charms inside seemed to hum faintly, a strange warmth emanating through the worn leather. "What do you want from me?" he shouted into the void. The only answer was laughter, soft at first, then building into a chorus of distorted, mocking voices. The sound was disorienting, as if it came from every direction at once. Alden spun around, his dagger raised, but there was nothing there. Only the fog, dense and impenetrable.